time or at least shortly after each other.
Yeah.
Mark?
Yeah, interestingly, why North America has been able to move that fast also is the abundance of low-cost agricultural grounds, right? So they're growing all these feedstocks without constraints, and as we know, in the European Union, there are intense constraints on being able to lose land for that purpose. So maybe also we need to take a look as a European Union to areas, countries where there's a lot of agricultural grounds available. I don't know, maybe certain portions of Africa or further Eastern Europe, and use that for that production and put some of the and stimulate that those plants will be built over there. Yeah. It's a consideration.
Yeah, and that comes back to the complicated regulation in Europe. Christoph and Andy, and then we should switch to the question. No, go ahead, but then we should switch to the question.
Sure, yeah, I'll just keep it short. I do think the geographical element is also important for each geography to look at what are the natural resources available in my region, what do I have an abundance of, and to really tap into that. So I don't think there's a single production pathway that will run the race. Yeah. We're following a diversification strategy when it comes to the technology.
Can I add one little thing to that? Sorry, that comes in. We're talking right now to a client that wants to build a very large SAF plant in Rotterdam. Yeah. And they have a feedstock advantage, exactly like you said. Part of their feedstock, it's always a mix of at least 4 feedstocks. And part of their feedstock will be coming from the wood industry. So they're a Scandinavian customer. Yeah. Lots of wood industry, and it's existing industry. It generates certain oils, etc., that can be used as a feedstock. So I thought that was a very interesting development. Yeah, you need to look indeed region by region what the advantages are.
I agree.
And we see lots of benefits of integrating agriculture and feed and food industries and fuel industries and material industries. And the circularity that you can get, the benefits you can get as you start improving the decarbonization of difficult to decarbonize industries. If you start to decarbonize and practice climate-smart agricultural processes, there are a lot of benefits that we can get all the way through the system and create the circularity that we're all looking for, and the benefits to rural communities, to farmers, a lot of other things that come along with this that are really positive.
Yeah. Let's take a look on the questions we received and asking for a quick answer on them. The first one is one I heard on several conferences on SAF already. Is it fair to ask general taxpayer to pay for subsidies, incentives, instead of raising ticket prices for only those who choose to fly? And that goes probably, Mark, to you and your statement on the IRA. I at least would direct it like this. How do you see that? Because that's clearly something that comes with the IRA funding system. Or anybody else, Christoph?
I think it's often a misconception to think that subsidies need to be paid by the taxpayer. And so there's different types of subsidies. I mean, there's so many policy instruments that do not require to go to Joe Blog for paying the industry. So for instance, the LCFS in the United States, where basically it's the polluters that, because they can't reach certain low carbon standards, have to buy credits from the ones that are below those low carbon standards. So that's also a mechanism where neither the taxpayer or the ticket pricing has to go up. And so there's different instruments that we should be considering in this.
Thanks.
I sort of like, in general, this is a very difficult one. In general, I like the idea of the polluter pays. Yeah. It has a logic to it. But at the same time, as a government, you need to look at what generates jobs for people and creates wealth in society, leading to a good living standard and health standard for everybody.
For everybody then, yeah, exactly.
Exactly, and I think the flying industry does generate that. Substantial benefits for the community. So I do think it starts with subsidies also paid by the general taxpayer.
So next one to Katja, and actually the sequence switched of the questions. Now it's the question whether Lufthansa is committed to eSubs and what are the 3 things Lufthansa would need to sign offtake agreements and use it.
3 things.
3 things, so it might be also 2 or 4, but not 1 or 10.
Yeah, I mean, we are committed to eSubs, we are committed to HEFA-SAF, bio-SAF. At the moment, it's only, because I saw that earlier as well, it's only bio-SAF available, obviously, HEFA technology, which we use. But we are busy in several e-fuel projects, and it's extremely expensive. It's like up to 5-6 times more expensive than already the HEFA-SAF. But as we have a sub-mandate in Germany maybe coming, and we have that in the EU coming, so obviously, yes, we're looking into that 3 things. First of all, we need security of supply, we need the finances for that, and we need proper regulation, safe regulations in place. And again, I have to emphasize, we need a level playing field that is global, because we fly from Europe to Asia to the US, and we need to have the same regulations everywhere. And that is the first thing. The level playing field is key for that. Absolutely. And there are many more questions to me before, but
yeah. And the next one, diving into the business secrets of Lufthansa already. So I don't know how much you can talk about that.
That was how much SAF did we purchase? We officially announced that. That's you have to differ between what we buy and what we sold to customers. So we purchased much more than we were able to sell so far, but we published that it's 15,000 tons last year only. So that's less than some other people, but it's hard to sell at the moment. And it's more, I saw that earlier as well, obviously with the fares, it's more the business customers and for business travel that pay, are willing to pay more, because companies have their policies for CO2 reduction, and therefore it's easier than to sell tickets to corporates and on business class and first class.
That also answered the question on who is the target customer for this. Nora, question to you. What could France do to get the EU SAF mandates to be carbon intensity based instead of volume based?
First, we just negotiated it, so we still have to implement the regulation, and already we have questions to change it. But there is a review clause in the Refuel EU regulation in 2028, where Commission have to assess the state of the market, the level playing field, and the impact on European airlines. So that would be the right time to negotiate again and maybe propose new mandates in carbon intensity based. That is more neutral and technological point of view.
Thanks. Katja, the question, I mean, mainly you, probably Christoph as well, you, what's the customer type? You told already it's business customers, it's business class, first class, it's where the ticket price add-on is not percentage-wise not that high. Anything to add on that for the customer?
Yeah, we did extensive research on that, and no surprise there really. Business class and first class passengers have a higher willingness to pay for SAF than economy passengers. I mentioned before I really like the Singapore policy because it does set different levels of levies for the passenger types. And also based, of course, on the length of the sector. So it creates that equal level playing field, but also takes into account the different types of classes.
What about selling to corporations not based on their individual flights, but based on their carbon targets? And you mentioned that. Is that a way of doing that for the airlines? Not selling it with the ticket, but selling volumes to corporations that have net zero ambitions?
That's what we do. I think PwC is one of our partners, right?
Yeah, I know.
And we're talking to your competitors, so you better be quick.
But if we could, that's a nascent market, right? And PwC and their competitors are early adopters in the nascent market of helping pay for carbon abatement. If we could develop that market, if we could all work on expanding that market so more corporations were involved in that, it would help the airlines in their burden to get this. Absolutely. We can't put this all on the aviation industry. It's got to be distributed, whether it's something like what Singapore did or getting other industries involved. That's how you get this to scale faster.
Then a question, Mark, probably with regard to your initial comment on the investment community. If investors need to recognize the risk of subplans, how do we attract this investment from those outside the aviation industry who have other options? Capital always flows where it makes the most money, the safest way.
It is a very complex patchwork, isn't it? You need clarity in regulation. That's where it starts. Certain mandates, clarity in regulation. Then feedstock is the majority of pricing of production cost. More than 50% of production cost of SAF comes from the feedstock.
Yep.
So you need all of that in place. There needs to be access. So for an investor, they look at all those things, the offtake agreements, etc. But indeed, then also the financeability of those projects. So I would say from that angle, something needs to come together, and we need to sit together with banks and financiers to create a climate of more collaborative. Yeah. We've been actually very successful in dealing in the world with new technologies and new types of projects. If you put a structure together where people are forced to collaborate more than the sticks. The sticks hammering down on people. So
yeah, it's more strategic partnership than transactional relationship.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So we get time signals already. I would like to ask my panelists for a last quick statement, and that's on the question: if you have one wish, and this time it's just one, Katja. If you have one wish, what you could change or what you could aim for in order to make the scale-up happen, what would that be in a short statement? Nora, starting with you maybe.
I would like the financial community to really mobilize and be clear on what they need from each other, you know, from every stakeholders. Because as I just said, it's too risky. We need, you know, visibility on the price of the feedstocks. We need a long-term offtake. But I think we have to go further and try to move on. So yeah, I'd like them to invest themselves a bit more.
Thanks. Katja, what's your wish?
Yeah, next to the level playing field, we need the Regulation Reduction Act in Europe.
Regulation Reduction Act, I like that one. Andy.
I have two. A fairy tale wish. I wish we could go back and wake up pre-pandemic so that we'd have construction and capital costs back at those levels. They've jumped 2-3 times on these billion-dollar assets in the last 3-4 years, and that's a problem that's caused all of us pain. The actionable wish would be to have a market value for carbon abatement that could help pay for the cost of SAF.
Thanks.
I don't like to wish because wishing is not a strategy, but I do think that there's a great opportunity if all of the different parties come together and work collaboratively towards the same solution. Whether it's SAF producers, governments, airlines, financiers. Yeah, if we all put ourselves behind the same thing in a good mindset, then we can definitely overcome this challenge.
You need to, I was first going to say what Nora says, so I couldn't agree more with what she said. So let me pick another angle. Let's put in place, you need to get over the hump. And once these projects start going, others will follow. You need to start with a 45Q type tax incentive, like in the United States. It will drive, there is money to be made, and you guarantee that for, say, 5 years or something, and then you reevaluate. Put that bag of money at the end of the rainbow, make it available, and there will be investors and very creative people running to it, allowing you to get over the hump.
It's all about greed at the end. Thanks a lot to my panelists. I really enjoyed discussing with you. I really enjoyed your views, your insights. Nora, Katja, Andy, Christoph, Mark, it was a pleasure and an honor for me to be your moderator. Thanks to you, and thanks for the questions.
To kickstart the morning. Next up, we've got a panel on policy, and I've got a very interesting mix of who's joining me. We've got Aaron Robinson from IAG, who has been not only the interim CEO of, I realize I didn't have the mic going, of Mission Possible Partnership, but also the former CEO of Schiphol Airport. And he did some rather bold things while he was at Schiphol as well. So I think we're going to have a good discussion. Now can I go there? By the way, since Haldane is pouring some water, would you please pour some water in this? This is my bottle to measure optimism. I'm quite optimistic after the first panel. Just a bit, just a bit. There you go. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I like the Singapore policy bit. So we're getting a bit more optimistic. Okay, hopefully the goal is to get the bottle half full by the end of the day. Okay, so we'll keep a watch. Thank you, Haldane. So why don't we start with Haldane. Haldane, we are looking at CAF 3 and COP28. You were there in person. What can you tell us about what CAF 3 is achieving? And for those who in the audience who don't know, what is even CAF 3?
Sorry, I was busy making ourselves more optimistic.
Thank you.
At the front here. So CAF 3, the Conference on Aviation Alternative Fuels, under the auspices of ICAO. Conferences in ICAO speak have a particular meaning. It's not just a conference like this is. It's actually a group of governments getting together and making decisions that have real-world implications on policy, etc. Now, these are ICAO policies, so they're not necessarily law in countries around the world. But what it does do is it sends a very important policy signal to countries around the world. And so the negotiations in the lead up to the CAF 3 meeting, which was held in Dubai about 3 weeks before COP28 last year, focused around how can we deliver a vision on SAF use in particular around the world. What does that vision look like? What's the number that sits around it? And of course, that's the headline that comes out. And the number that was delivered was by 2030, there should be a 5% reduction in emissions through the use of SAF and LCAF, but mainly, of course, SAF around the world. So that's the figure that came out, and that's obviously the thing that captures the headline. But I think actually the more important thing that comes out of a discussion like that is the global framework that sits around it. So how do we make that happen? And importantly, and recognize that we're in Europe right now, and obviously there's a lot of discussion and action in North America as well. How do we make sure that SAF is not just a European and North American story, but something that can also be of benefit to economies in other parts of the world, particularly the developing world, and what role can ICAO play as a UN organization to help drive that? And so we can get into that in a bit more detail. When it comes to COP28 and the COP process more broadly, actually aviation is not a big role within the COP process. Obviously, we have our own UN agency, ICAO, and quite deliberately back in Kyoto, back in 1997, it was decided that ICAO should deal with international air transport. IMO should deal with international shipping because they fall outside of the way that you split the world into different countries in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So our role at COPs is really just to make sure that in reality, to make sure that the negotiators there understand what their cousin negotiators are doing at ICAO, even though they work for the same government, they don't always speak. So there's a lot of information sharing in that sense.
I'm glad. Before you wrap that up, of course, ATAC released the long-term aspirational roadmap a few years ago. With CAF 3 and COP28 now done, is that still on track, or are we falling behind?
That's a good question. I think, the Waypoint 2050 is specifically aimed at how do we get to 2050. So we didn't have specific milestones along the way. It is something that we are going to be looking at now that we've got CAF 3 and the agreement there. We can start plugging in some of these numbers, not only from CAF 3, but also the mandates that we're starting to see come in and around the world and make sure that they're part of the analysis as well. If you're asking me whether we are on track to get to where we need to in 2050, I would say probably not at the moment. However, However, we still have time to make sure that we can get on track to where we need to go. It's doable, it's achievable, but we need to make sure that we move in the next 5 years to get us on track.
We're going to get into those actions shortly. We have airline, airport, and partnerships here on the panel as well. So let me move to Aaron now. Aaron, IAG recently ordered, I think, more SAF than most other airlines that I know, like real SAF, not some future offtakes. You, of course, previously were at United, which is the global leader in offtakes. And now you're at IAG and you're ordering a lot of real SAF, not just offtakes. Where do you see the airline approach working, not working? How do we scale offtakes versus real SAF today? How do you balance both of these things?
Yeah, thanks, Shashank. I mean, I think it's important to certainly to look at the future and to be advancing kind of what's to come. But present today progress is very critical here and now as well. Last year at International Airlines Group, we used 53,000 tons of SAF, which was, to put it into some context, still below 1% of our total. It was 0.7%.
To give that context, with Lufthansa, that's 3 times Lufthansa's.
That's about right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. The good news is that, or the bad news, depends how you want to look at it, and to your point on track versus off track, that was the third most of any airline group globally. So there's still plenty of work to do. The good news, I would say, is that globally, the numbers we're seeing say that airlines increased their SAF use year over year by 150%. We were beyond that. We were about a 400% increase. So we're going to need plenty of those multiples to be stacking up and getting to that kind of exponential growth. Now, is it going to flatten at some point? Yes, of course. But it's super critical to, yes, build out kind of that today trajectory, but also ultimately that certainly longer term pipeline. Because as we heard from the last panel, GEVO in particular, we're going to need all of those new facilities. We're going to need more. We need to make sure we're not hitting constraints and ceilings at some point.
You talked about buying SAF today. I mean, why would, let's say I'm the head of sustainability for an airline and I go to the CFO and I say, CFO, give me $1 million or euros. I want to buy SAF. Will the CFO say, well, today you're not required to buy the SAF. Why would you still buy it instead of ordering a lot more SAF for the same million 15 years from now, an offtake?
Well, it's certainly a problem of today versus tomorrow. That's what the CFOs are supposed to be doing and asking about. I would also point out that the costs and risks of doing it 5 years, 10 years, whatever in the future is going to be a lot higher and a lot worse, in fact, as well. And I'm not just talking the cost of SAF, I'm talking the cost of what it does ultimately to the industry and then certainly industry demand that leads on someone. I mean, we're here in one of those epicenters, right? With the Schiphol cap that was proposed a few years ago and ultimately rolled back to really see what is that true impact. It's hard to go and project the future, right? What are the different scenarios that could lead to impacts for us? Is it just a cost increase? When is a demand cap really going to happen? But when you have those instances that are starting to appear, then you can really go and recognize that, okay, this is in fact now a serious threat.
So Dick, I think this is a good time to bring you in. Perhaps you can start first with a quick word about the Mission Possible partnership, what it's about. But then, of course, you were the CEO of Schiphol when the cap was proposed, and now it's rolled back. How do you feel about that?
Good morning, and great to be here. Mission Possible Partnership is a non-profit from companies and think tanks that wants to drive decarbonization in what we call the harder to abate sectors, and that includes aviation, and we are very active in that space. Per your question on where we are currently, we just published, you can find it on the Mission Possible website, a global project tracker for all those sectors in terms of what is actually happening on the supply side. And you can see there that there's, throughout the world at the moment, if we have found it correctly, something like 33 facilities that actually produce or can produce sustainable aviation fuel. At least 10 are at FID stage or beyond and into construction. and about 130 have been announced worldwide. But if you then look back at the scenarios, as you have made, as we have made at Mission Possible as well, and you look at net zero 2050, where do you have to be around 2030, also in the terms of the use of SAF, which is the thing for 2030 indeed, we need about 300 plants worldwide. So you see the gap.
That's a 10x growth we need in the next
in order to get to
6 years.
somewhere around, you could say that's an ambitious target, but on the way to 2050, if you want to have, like, let's say 10% SAF worldwide in 2030, you need 300 plants. We have a tenth of that at the moment. If you want to get to those plants in 2030, you have to build the rest of them in the next 2 or 3 years, or at least take FID. So the double message, like on many topics, yes, we have started, but the pace is not high enough. We have to accelerate, and we have to start to scale up, and that is the name of the game. What we are looking at, and you see the commitments are there by now. I would say so, even up to the level of ICAO. It took a bit of a while. Airports, airlines. Oh yeah, finally ICAO. It helped. It did not help the sector how late we were there in order to align with Paris and net zero. Because we did something earlier on already, 10, 12 years ago, and that created mistrust. You see that everywhere. But the commitment is there, and it's now turning into action. But there's still a lot to be done. It does not go by itself. And we can talk about the commercial side and the contracting, or the supportive policies and regulations, about demand orchestration, about ESEF, about standards and certification. All of it has to be addressed in the coming months and years in order to get the ball further rolling.
Dick, you mentioned 33 plants. Of these 33 that are functional today globally, are these commercial scale or are these demo plants?
No, it's not demo, but it's combinations of, and size varies, of course, and you see that. But we are getting to very big plants, like 1 million tons in Singapore, Rotterdam. You see developments in the US, as mentioned. So world-scale plants are being built, actually. So it's beyond the demo stage. And now the technology pathways have been mentioned, and they will get us started. But beyond 2030, it's very clear that we have to get into the ESEF developments as well, because the slivers of bio at some point in time will reach their max because of obvious reasons of feedstock availability. So one of the things we have been doing now, Mission Possible, together with Systemic, is put together, at least starting in Europe, an ESEF coalition of producers, OEMs, airlines, airports, to see if we can create this collaboration, because that's the key word. The partnership is a key word. And can we get started, because there's a mandate, there's an obligation, but how are we going to do that? And let's not drive against the wall. Let's not start to tell the European Commission in 3-4 years' time, sorry, there's no production, we cannot buy it, we cannot use it, please change the regulation. Because we are under scrutiny in aviation, we are not always trusted on what we do. People think we are not going fast enough, that degrowth is the solution indeed, instead of the transformation and the transition. So if we do not drive the transition ourselves at the required pace, we will start to face consequences with illogical policies and interventions that will not make the industry happy. So we have to find ways to get to it, and everybody was mentioned in this previous panel as well. Everybody has to contribute in whatever position you are, and come together and make it happen. And therefore, this initiative, for example, on ESEF, because that if you look at the green premiums in any industry, ESEF is the Mount Everest of green premiums to be attacked. The other way around, if we are able to do it in the aviation value chain, it's a relatively simple one. There's an energy company, an airline, and a customer. Now let's do it. If you want to do green fertilizer into your barley, into your beer, you start with hydrogen, ammonia, fertilizer, agriculture, barley, malt, beer. And we have to do those as well, and all those scope 3 emissions in the world. So let's do the relatively simple ones, and we think it's extremely difficult in aviation. Yes, it is, because of the size and the time effort and the size of the green premium. But you have to be careful as well. It was mentioned in the last panel. We always talk about it's 3 times, it's 6, 7 times more expensive. Yeah, but that's the 100% world. We're living in the below 1% world at the moment, as described. If you do 10% on a flight from Amsterdam to Barcelona in 2030, that's like 20 euros. 20 euros. That's noise against inflation. That's noise against the variability in the charges. So I would say we don't have an affordability issue per se. Yes, we need incentives, we need support like every other beginning industry, but it's more like a coordination problem. Are we able to, between ourselves, to get the contracts in place, to get the plans built, to get the stuff contracted, and to be able to charge it to the customers who will be able to pay that amount. And then the learning curve starts to kick in at some point in time. I don't think ESAF will ever be the same price as kerosene, but we will be getting closer. So coordination issues, therefore collaboration.
The interesting question there is, what is the cost of fossil jet? You know, we always talk about it being parity with fossil jet. We also need to take into account other factors as well, including cost of carbon, the impact of the cost of not going to net zero on our business. You mentioned, you know, potential reputational issues and demand reductions and so forth, but also just the cost of doing business, cost of insurance, etc. Dick, you mentioned something that I've said a few times as well, which is, yes, we are a hard to abate sector. You know, we are a challenge in that sense, but in many ways we have all the ingredients that we need to make this a success because we are a very well coordinated sector. Doesn't always feel like it when you're in the mix of this, but we have an industry that works very well together and tackles big challenges all the time. We have a UN body that's dedicated to us, where we can go and make a difference, and we have. And so we have the ingredients that we need to get the action right. And I think one of the different things about this challenge for us is that we are bringing in outside organizations and outside sectors, and one of those is finance. And for the last year, and certainly this year as well, our organization's really been focused on reaching out to the finance sector to lay the base for what is needed for them to invest in SAF and the capital that's needed for SAF construction over the coming decades. There's a lot of interest in that space, and I hope that there are a lot of finance people in the room here as well. We need to sort of move faster in that area, but that's really important. I think one of the key areas that are key sectors that is not really playing the game so far is traditional energy sector. And we need to see a lot more movement from them in a very serious way before we get on track.
The interesting thing is, this is great, and you know we have a global movement, and the industry is working together. I get to speak to a lot of airline heads of sustainability in different parts of the world. And what's interesting is when we talk about feedstocks, the conversation changes radically based on who you're speaking with and where. You speak to a Qantas or Virgin Australia, it's a very different conversation than someone in Europe, where HEFA is not an option in short term to medium term, versus someone in the US, it's corn, you know, Iowa farmers for the win. It's a very different conversation. And I've actually heard of, I'm not kidding you, I've heard of feedstocks like coconut to SAF, palm oil to SAF, which sounds rather counterintuitive because you have to clear a rainforest to plant palm oil to begin with. And you get there. But the key is, given that we need to scale SAF so much, we need 10x the plants just in the next 6 years. Can there be just a single pathway, or is each country and each region going to be on its own? And I would love to hear, would IAG abide by the EU regulations when it comes to sourcing SAF in different parts of the world? Will there be a synchronization from a policy framework perspective, or is it going to be whatever is available locally, we'll just use that as a pathway to SAF?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see any kind of global harmonization, especially when it comes to feedstock. I mean, ultimately, in every region, you know, the old adage is all politics is local, right? And you have to figure out what creates that economic interest and push in your region to ultimately get that done. Now, are there going to be standards that exist on a voluntary basis, let's say, to go and say we're not going to go and do this? I mean, for instance, we have a policy: we don't buy any SAF that contains palm oil, for example. If that you know, if that becomes kind of what's necessary in a given region, or what, you know, that region ends up going and adopting, if it's something by regulation, well, then we have a problem because we have to abide with local laws and regulations, right? But ultimately, we want to see solutions and adopt the solutions that do make sense, in fact, for each of those local environments, and enable those to happen. But are we going to get there overnight? No. I mean, it's going to take quite a while to get to any of those policies ultimately to really adopt and adapt, in fact, to those circumstances.
Do you foresee an overarching policy playing a role here, or will it be each man on his own?
To a certain extent, and I think that we see that through ICAO. It is useful to have the policy direction of an agreement like CAF 3 and whatever follows in CAF 4 and CAF 5, for sure. But each country needs to take its own path to a certain extent. Each company needs to as well. You know, we're always saying we've got these global roadmaps in place, like Waypoint 2050 and various others, but actually that is very high level. Each airline, each airport, etc., needs to do its own work to figure out how it's going to get to net zero in its own way. And the same thing happens in the policy environment. We are going to see a range of different feedstocks. We've always said that there was never going to just be one pathway for aviation. That's a benefit because it gives us diversity of supply, it gives us resilience to a certain extent in that area as well. And it also takes advantage of local opportunities and the most efficient use of resources at a local level. On a policy level, I think there is a role for global coordination to a certain extent, and one of the areas there is around sustainability criteria. And so it is important to set a baseline for sustainability criteria, and we've certainly got that through the CORSIA SAF and the eligible fuels that are used in CORSIA. And actually, for a globally agreed set of criteria between governments, civil society, and industry, it's a pretty robust set of criteria. That can be added to in different regions around the world, but it should at least set some kind of standard for how we approach this. And that's really important because we are a global industry. We do need to be able to fly between different countries, but we shouldn't be constrained by that as well.
Yeah, I think the important aspect here is, I agree totally with what has been said in terms of different pathways, technologies, feedstocks, local circumstances. But there are, of course, minimum standards in terms of the definition of what SAF is and does it qualify as SAF. There are sustainability criteria, especially around bio in terms of the indirect land use, competition with food crops or not, etc. So that is extremely important as well. Indeed, many airlines have singled out oil palm that they will not use it. That has even led to changes, for example, at Neste in Rotterdam. They have biodiesel where there's oil palm in it. But in their jet fuel that they produce, there will not be any oil palm in it. So that has consequences for the way they produce, for example. But there's in general, I would say, and on your point, Haldane, we have a relatively organized aviation world with a set of players who know each other, who can work together. And even then we see that we have still different standards across the world. The US standard is different from the European one in terms of the level of CO2 reduction required. And of course we are still working on the accounting, the certification, let alone if we go into book and claim, which we have to, and then the registries for that and the acceptance of that. And that's extremely important for two aspects. First of all, it's all about then trust. Can we trust what aviation is doing by governments and by customers? And in order to create trust, it has to be completely transparent, but preferably as simple as possible. So I would argue with the various initiatives that there are, and there are initiatives on book and claim and RMI, and is working on that, and others get involved, and the registries and the certification, that we try to, if it's not harmonized, that we try to simplify it as much as possible, because the one thing we have to prevent, that in 3 years' time the world will look at the use of SAF and then the credits and the way they're being used, as we look at CO2 credits compensation at the moment. That has been an issue for over 20 years in the world, 25 years. It's not being solved, they're not credible. Enormous issues around everything which has to do with compensation, and that has to do with transparency, quality, all of that. And if we get into that situation, that has to be prevented by all means. So it's the nitty-gritty work of what is ongoing, but from the standard to the accounting, to the certification, to the registries, to the book and claim, it has to be credible, and it has to be understandable both for governments and for customers. Otherwise, our push for SAF will end in a quagmire if we're not careful.
Dick, in your former life, you were the Deputy Foreign Minister, I believe, of Netherlands. When we talked to a lot of countries, we saw in the earlier chart I showed how the global south is where the growth is coming forth within aviation. You know, you've got India, Turkey, Indonesia. That's where the growth is coming from. SAF is becoming a bit of an energy security issue for a number of countries as well. Do you foresee that playing a role out of these 33 plants? I don't think a lot of these are in the developing world, but going forward, you're going to have everyone from Kazakhstan to Australia to India building their own SAF facilities to have energy security for their airlines. Do you foresee that becoming a core issue going forward?
Yes, absolutely. And so there's two pushes there. One is to contribute to sustainability, because countries want to contribute and have commitments, although it's not part of their national defined contribution. Still, they want to participate and to push. We're at that stage. And secondly, we're of course in a completely different world now than we were 5 or 10 years ago in terms of geopolitical tension. So everything that relates to autonomy, strategic autonomy, promoting relevant businesses, you see industry policy back, and it has two effects. On the one hand, it will help countries to move in order to create their own production, in order to have this level of comfort. On the other side, we probably will be living in a world which is a bit less efficient. So on the cost side, it's not going to help, but still. And you see it, you see it in Brazil, which has a great potential as well. So there will be a lot of development, and there was then there was a UAE or Mubadala investment, 12 billion into Brazil, which goes into biodevelopment, but also points towards SAF. India is very much on the move, and has its own policy. I think it's even a mandate there, or a mandate in the making, something like that. So that's extremely important. I think Australia is waking up to its own potential, not just exporting raw materials, but starting to produce the green products as well, including SAF. And the federal government just announced a bit of an IRA-like approach for Australia just this week. So you see things moving there, and it's very clear that the next wave of developments should be in the global south as well, next to what we see US, EU, China.
No, that's absolutely right. The level of interest from developing nations in this is really, really high. And it's interesting because a number of countries that have been mentioned do have policies in place, whether that's a blend mandate or a version of that. We've seen a lot of development in that area. And one of the things that we wanted to get out of CAF3 was this framework that allowed that to be supported. Because of course, if we're talking about the investment risk in SAF production that we're seeing in Europe and North America and all the questions that come along with that, obviously that's amplified even more in developing economies, because they generally have a higher risk profile from an economy perspective for investment as well. So how can we get over that? One of the things that did come out of the CAF3 discussions was an agreement to set up a Finvest hub under ICAO. So this is a matchmaking service that ICAO will be running that will put together potential projects in developing economies with potential donors, funders, investors in the developed world and through multilateral institutions as well, trying to take advantage of the potential for blended finance, to de-risk some of the early stage investment, and then private money come in after that and really scale up the investment that's needed. But there's a huge amount of interest across the world for security reasons, but also just for economic reasons.
When is this matching system going live? This is very interesting.
It's being developed right now. Hope is that there's going to be the first of a sort of a conference, if you like, of matchmaking next year. But it's in progress right now.
So in 2023, 74% of the world's SAF was used by European airlines. From what we can see excuse me, that was in 22. In 23, that figure went above 80%. And I think it's going to stay above 80% for quite some time because of the mandates. Now, we're going to need, in the long run, we need that number to drop to 25, right? Because that means that then SAF is going to be universal ultimately. But for the rest of the world, I mean, I think it's not just, yes, it's all of these things, kind of policy, finance. You ask most people, what's the biggest challenge? Most will say policy, others will say finance. To me, it's about civil society and environmental consciousness. I mean, when I moved from the US to Europe, I did it in part because I knew that level of consciousness and awareness, and therefore action speaks louder than words, was higher. You go to the rest of the world, it's a low level today because it's a low priority. They see climate change as not their problem, but the fault of developed countries and developed economies, in fact. So it's something that, to me, the core of it is always starting with the civil society and having those social changes that then lead themselves, in fact, to policy changes which enable that financial capability to come in.
It's interesting you mentioned 75%, you said?
74, yeah.
74%.
Yeah.
If I recall right, a few years ago, 80% of the global SAF supply was in California. So did the European airlines uplift this in California or in Europe?
It certainly was at the time. I mean, when I was at United, I remember the whole world would flock, in fact, to California to buy that SAF because that's where it was available. That's where certainly the incentives had been created to enable that more affordably. Today, we've got different policy structures that enable and lead to different financial outcomes and incentives that lead to saying, well, now the magnet has essentially shifted over to Europe and is going to stay that way, I think, for quite a while. But we're going to need lots of individual magnets, right? And it's a good thing in many ways, right, to have governments competing, in fact, for it, right? Because it's, when you look at in the US, things like state-level incentives, some of them are structured not just for the SAF, but for job creation, right? And that, in fact, speaks to the broader benefits, in fact, that SAF and decarbonization can enable.
Where does this leave us with book and claim? It's something we discussed on the earlier panel just a little bit, but we've talked about energy security, countries building their own SAF facilities. But book and claim, is this a short-term play? Do you foresee the importance of book and claim growing over time? Do you currently at IAG use book and claim?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we do. We think it's very important. Ultimately, you need book and claim when you have something that is not universal or when you have price disparities that exist across regions and you want to enable those benefits sooner. I mean, I think those price disparities are going to last for a long time. I think we're going to see supply disparities for a long time, right? If we talk about, as an airline, getting to 100% SAF, which we don't have as a goal, but I imagine at some point we will probably set that as a goal or something similar. You know, we're not going to get to 100% SAF everywhere. We're not in 2050 going to be buying a lot of SAF in Saudi Arabia or Nigeria or other petro economies like that because the cost affordability just isn't there. But so we're going to need book and claim like elements for quite a long time to enable those kind of outcomes in terms of what economic impact and therefore climate impact we're really having, even if it's not, in fact, tied directly to where the aircraft, where's the fuel, and where those pieces fit.
The optimist in me says that by 2050 we should be able to get 100% SAF from Saudi Arabia. And I'd like to see that, because if anybody's got the money to be able to put into that instead of building lines in the desert, I think Saudi Arabia is certainly the one. Was that provocative enough?
The fact that you're in Amsterdam and not in Riyadh, where there's another big conference going on, speaks volumes.
This is true. Although I did say it when I was in Riyadh a couple of years ago. I said the same thing. So I think book and claim is going to be a really important part of the ramp-up process. You know, not wanting to put predictions on it, I think it's really important for the next 15 years to really scale up around the world. And as Dick said, you know, there are a number of different book and claim systems that there are in the world. It's really important that there's coordination, harmonization between them. There's not going to be ever one book and claim system, but to make sure that there is a standard of accounting that can go between them, that they do talk to each other. IATA has been putting a lot of effort into that. I was involved in one of the meetings which did my brain in because of how complex some of the underlying technical discussions are. So I left that to them, but certainly there is an effort underway to make sure that there is coordination there. But I think book and claim also has a role to play in that development story as well, because it helps the business case for plants being developed in the developing world. If the feedstocks are there, if the facilities are available, if there is a potential for job creation in those countries, what is adding to that business case up? One of the things could be book and claim to allow the sales of the product that come out of there to be sold to European and North American airlines that have mandates to comply with. But you don't need to ship that fuel everywhere in the world. It can be used by local carriers and local airports. So there is a development role for book and claim, I think, as well, as long as the mandates will allow that to be used. And of course, we need to make sure that Europe does change its mind on that.
Thank you. We're open to questions as well, by the way, so you can ask a question through the app or just raise your hand and, you know, I'll throw the mic to you. We'll take questions as well. Dick, since we have you here, there's a question here. If the industry fails to support scale-up of SAF, will the public vote to remove the social license for aviation to operate? So I think this is a nicely disguised question to what you did at Schiphol.
No, absolutely, and we have, of course, always the local issues, which tend to be the responsibility for the airports. And we have the global issue, and it's clear that if we are not convincing in terms of reducing our footprint, either locally and or globally, that there will be a reaction to it. But we have to be mindful as well that as citizens, we are, of course, of two minds. We fly, and at the same time, we judge, so to say, or we express ourselves politically, and that's not always consistent. But what I would like to see as well, and the previous panel, it was mentioned as well by the airlines, that we are able to, and I think we have to do it a bit more confidently as well from the sector to tell the story about SAF, because not everybody is aware. And many people will say nothing is happening, or you haven't started yet, or it's not possible. And that we try to involve people as much as possible, because many people, the most critical as well, who then drive this political agenda, which is not always very productive, they have a dilemma. But the means to solve your dilemma are becoming available. If you fly an airline that not just offers trees and offsets, but offers you to buy into SAF or a portion of SAF for your flight in terms of greening your own flight at your own expense, then you can start to solve your own dilemma. And personally, I must say, apart from the regulation, I have been instrumental in the past to get the mandate in Europe established, but I'm a big fan to have an aspiration and an ambition that on top of regulation or on top of even individual commitments like the US airlines have, that we are driving and developing the market. And individual customers, yes, and to a large extent as well business customers. Because if you look at, all companies in the world have extremely tight 2030 targets. If you're Deloitte or if you're Microsoft or if you whoever, PwC, -40, -60% in 2030. if you're in tech, you have your cloud problem, but otherwise you have offices and you have flying. They will be big customers of SAF. But in order to do that and go beyond, let's say, the dabbling that everybody does in the first contract and let's try, it has to account. So if we don't get book and claim in order, and if we don't, and if the greenhouse gas protocol is not going to allow for that, or to, then it will not account as a scope 3 emission reduction. And then Microsoft will still do its first contract, like it does, but its second, third, and fourth contract, which will get them from a few percent of the Microsoft scope 3 emissions to 10, 20, 30, 40% or 60% of their emissions. Therefore, you need that system again as well. And but I'm a big believer that that we have to speak and to express ourselves very confidently that we have started, that not just the commitment in place, that the action is being taken, that everybody will have to do its or her part, but then we can activate the market as well. Also because, and I've been in energy before Schiphol, I worked at Shell, and sometimes you see that companies become almost paralyzed by the idea that the perfect policy and the perfect regulation landscape is not there. You start to advocate for that, and you still have to do that. But don't make yourself dependent upon it, because we will be living in an imperfect policy world and an imperfect regulation world. Apart from all the other imperfect elements of our world that will only grow. So you have to take charge yourself, take your responsibility, shape your environment, get your customers involved. And if airlines don't do it, the energy companies will do it. And one of the tensions that is in the room, of course, is World Energy illustrated that in 1 week they contracted with DHL, scope 1 and scope 3, and they contracted with Microsoft as well for scope 3. So that fuel is still there for airlines to sell, but the scope 3 is not there to sell to their customers anymore. So there's unease in terms of who is going to deal with the customers in terms of the full service of decarbonization, including the scope 3. There's a kind of a tension building as well. Let's see how that plays out. But my advice to airlines is be extremely proactive in terms of the relationship with your customers if you want to have the full custody of the value chain, including the scope 3 attributes. Otherwise, other mechanisms are going and other players are going to deal with it.
Aaron, do you want to add the airline perspective?
I will. I think there's a misperception that decarbonization is expensive. And I'm going to explain that and justify that. But my family has not lived in the Netherlands for 400 years. We moved out a long time ago. So Dick, please correct my Dutch in a moment here. But the word for sustainability in Dutch is duurzaam. Then fortunately, it contains the word duur in it, which means expensive.
Expensive.
And that is, it's not like, I haven't found that in other languages. I have certainly found it in Dutch, but I think there's this misperception of it being expensive. And I would say it's the other way around. Not decarbonizing, not being sustainable is far more expensive. And that's what we have to think about in any of this decision-making, in any of these processes.
I wish you would repeat this in Houston, where we have a lot of oil majors coming in for that conference.
I think just picking up on Dirk's point of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, we need to think about that when it comes to feedstock as well. I don't know whether you were able to see it, but most of the questions were about eSAF and about PTL and where are we going to get with that. It's incredibly important that we go there. We know that that is going to be the majority of SAF in the future. But today we have the ability to produce SAF much more cost effectively than PTL. We need to get that ramped up as well. So we can't just skip over the fact that we've got HEFA, that we've got ATJ as well. We need to be ramping those up to where they need to get to naturally, and then be working on PTL at the same time. But let's not only think that PTL is the only solution here, because we need it fast and we need it at scale, and that's available today.
We've got a minute left, so to wrap up, what's the one thing that gives you the most hope about the future of sustainable aviation?
So for me, I'm a musician on the side, and my inspiration comes from Leonard Bernstein, the American composer and conductor, and he says, to achieve greatness, you need two things, only two things. You need a good plan and not enough time. So I think we've got both of them.
Both of those.
We've got both of those.
Good start. Haldane.
The fact that we're actually getting this done at the moment. We're already making progress. We are putting in place the building blocks that are needed. We need to build them faster, yes, and we need to build them bigger, but we are actually getting this done. And the will out there is really big within the industry, and we need to bring on some of the other players to make sure that they have that will as well.
Dick? Well, there's outsized attention for aviation, and that sometimes annoys the sector. But it gives a huge opportunity as well, because everybody is looking at it, and everybody, every customer, almost every customer, every business customer is thinking about its own footprint. Tap into that.
Definitely in the city we are in, and my hope is that the aviation industry stops fighting on back foot and stops playing defense and goes on the front foot and talks about what we're talking about here to the outside world. You know, have a conversation over dinner with your kids or with your in-laws, and that's what we did over Christmas, for example, talking about the Virgin 100 flight. It was a Christmas conversation, which was interesting. With that, I would like to thank the panelists. Thank you very much for this invigorating discussion. Now we do have a break outside for 30 minutes. Please be back at 10:45 in 30 minutes, and I've been corrected, we've got just 100 copies of the books to be signed, so meet me outside and I'm really happy to sign them. Exactly. Well, it's good that it's diversified.
They swung off of California for a number of reasons.
There's Oregon, there's Washington State, there's Michigan now.
California has one of the
Yes. Is that World Energy? Outside LA?
And that's where I started my...
Really? At World Energy?
Yeah, World Energy.
in 2000.
I talked to those guys a lot.
Cool, cool.
Welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone got a good break, got some coffee, got a few remaining copies of the book, and sorry for those who only got the bookmarks. I'm sure we will figure out a way to get books to you. But thank you for the support. Next up, we have a policy discussion. We always keep hearing about carrots versus sticks, incentives versus mandates. What works better? We had some very interesting figures earlier in the panel from Aaron. But now, let me introduce to you, he's been referred to as the Dean of Sustainable Aviation, as the Steve Jobs. But let me add another one. He's the godfather of sustainable aviation in Europe. You just need to, let me introduce you to Jonathan Council. If you do not know Jonathan, you have been living under a rock or somewhere very far from Europe. But Jonathan, please lead this panel.
Thank you, Shashank, for giving my team more material to make even more fun out of me. Yeah, thank you.
Godfather is going to stick.
Yeah, Godfather. Goodness me. Hello, yeah, good morning. So yes, in this session, we're going to get into sort of details on policy, particularly the US versus the EU. So we sort of set this up like the Ryder Cup of SAF policy, yeah? So on my right, I have the US team, and on my left, I have the EU team. And this is often talked about as carrot versus stick. I think generally people think that the US approach is more carrot and the EU approach is more stick, but we'll get into the details of that. And we are going to ask a question at the beginning, at the end, the same question at the beginning and end. So they're just setting up a poll, and it basically is who thinks the US has the more effective SAF policy, and then who thinks the EU has the more effective SAF policy, and then we'll repeat that question at the end to see if we've changed anybody's view. But by way of context, what I'm going to do is just got a couple of slides just to get this set up. So the first one you saw yesterday. Sorry, the slides, yeah, they're coming. Good. So, so the first one is one I showed yesterday. So this is basically, so courtesy of IATA, thank you IATA. So I'm not going to go into the details. So this basically is the landscape of SAF policy around the world as of about a month ago. Basically, you can see that red and yellow is mandate. So definitely the world is heading down the mandate path. That's sort of, this, if you think about it, that's an obvious one for governments. It's relatively easy to do, and it's relatively low cost. The outlier, the green there, is the US. And we're going to get into the discussion of the reasons why they're really focusing on incentives versus mandates. And the question is, how do you measure the relative success of those different policy approaches? Well, one is, you know, how many plants are getting funded? And I would like to, I've stole a slide that was presented on Tuesday, so thank you, Sightline Climate. So basically, this is the number of plants that have broken ground and been announced. So sort of clear, even though there's more plants happening in Europe, definitely the US is in the lead. So that would tend to indicate that the policy is more effective there. So I don't know, are we ready on the poll? So let's go on the poll. Here we go. That's pretty good. So interesting. So has everybody had a chance to? So we'll give that. Okay, that's slightly surprising. Yeah. Anyway, that's good. Okay. The US guys have woken up. How many? Come on, US. So not anyway. You can only vote once. Only vote once. Yeah. Okay, we'll let that run for a second. And what I'm going to do first of all is just let each of my panelists just introduce themselves, who they work for, and their interest in the SAF area. So maybe starting on my left, Ruben.
Good morning, Ruben Oblas. I work for KLM Reuters Airlines, based here in Amsterdam, part of the public affairs team, and from that area specifically focusing on sustainability and innovation, which is still the case for sustainable aviation fuels. So I'm involved in the file since 2009 and trying to make some progress. So it's a tough challenge, but we get there.
Good. Thank you, Ruben. Marcel.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm Marcel. I'm the Director of Aviation Policy and Strategy at FOCA, the Swiss Civil Aviation Authority. My division is responsible for quite a broad range of topics, so not only environment, but also international coordination, regulation of new technologies such as drones, even planning permits, building permits for aerodromes, as well as interactions with our parliament and the political level. So I'm probably the most, or sort of the least knowledgeable person here on the panel when it comes to details about SAF policy. However, I hope I'll be able to maybe add some value when we discuss political feasibility of policy changes or stuff like that. As I'm sure you know, Switzerland is not an EU member state. That allows me to somehow represent Team Europe here in a very sort of unbound way, and I'm looking forward to that. Maybe one word what's going on in Switzerland at the moment. We will adopt the refuel regulation fully, so there will also be a blending mandate in Switzerland. However, on the sort of the carrot part of the policy, we will go with a different route where we will set up a specific fund for aviation.
Thank you, Marcel. Graham.
Thanks very much. My name is Graham Noyes. I'm a long-term veteran of the biofuel industry, started back in 2000 with World Energy when it was a startup, led sales and business development there and at Imperium Renewables, and then switched back over to practicing law, really focused in on the environmental attributes. So first the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard and then the Low Carbon Fuel Standard in California. I co-founded the Low Carbon Fuels Coalition, which works to support and expand low carbon fuel policies. And we've been successful in bringing sustainable aviation fuel into the California, Oregon, and Washington programs on an opt-in basis. I'm no longer the executive director of the LCFC. I'm now focusing primarily on SAF work. I represent 6 of the leading SAF producers in the United States on state-level SAF policy primarily, but I'm seeing the convergence with federal and international policies, so thinking I need to really work across all systems, and have really been appreciating this great conference. Over to Ken.
Thanks, Graham. I'm very relieved about that because I think you genuinely are the godfather of SAF, so you can take that one. Ken, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. My name is Ken Hill. I'm a strategy consultant based in the U.S. My background, I work a lot with clients both in Europe and in the U.S. primarily. My background really comes from the industrial chemicals and oil refining industry for about 20 years, and then moving into renewable fuels, biofuels about 15 years ago. Mostly, my work had been outside the U.S., in places like Central Europe, Southeast Asia, Brazil, until the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. And now my focus has turned back a lot to the U.S. because of the incentives that we're going to talk about today. One of my clients, luckily, is the U.S. Department of Energy. So we'll get a little bit more into some of those things today, and some of those carrots that we were talking about, and learning how that might incentivize some of these projects. Currently, I'm working in the U.S. on about $40 billion worth of SVF investment financing projects. So there's, as that graph showed, there's a lot happening.
Thank you. So I think you can see we've absolutely got the right people on the panel to talk about the different policy regimes. What we're going to do first off is just give you a reminder of what those regimes look like. Then we'll get into the pros and cons, some of the risks, and maybe the lessons that can be learned by each area. But we'll start off on the EU side. So I think, Marcel, you're going to give us the first sort of overview of, we've heard a lot about the EU mandate. Want to talk a little bit around some of the potential incentives that we have. So Marcel, over to you.
Sure, yeah, I think you're right. Yesterday and also this morning, I think after these discussions, everybody should now be familiar with the content of refuel and the blending mandate, as well as the RED directive, as well, or ETS, sort of everything that pertains more to the stick of the EU policy. But I think we've talked a bit less about the carrot, Some people even said that you need to search for the carrot. I don't think so, but yeah, I'll mention it anyway. I think there are two main elements that I'd like to stress. One is the SAF allowances. This was brought forward by a recent ETS revision. These SAF allowances, creates 20 million dedicated allowances that operators can use to credit to the price difference between SAF and conventional jet fuel. And the way it works is that the amount that you can credit depends on the production path on the SAF that you want to procure. So for third generation e-fuels, syn-fuels, you get 95%. For second generation biofuels, you get, I think, 70%. And for all the rest, under the red eligible SAF, you get 50%. So that's in a nutshell how the SAF allowances scheme works. And the second element that I'd like to mention is the sort of the pure carrot, so to speak. Is the EU Innovation Fund. This is a general green fund that's not ring-fenced for aviation, but is relevant or can be used to support all kinds of green transition projects in the EU. The size of the fund depends on the carbon price, because the fund is compiled out of money that is being generated from auctioning off ETS certificates across all industries. So if we assume a 75 euro price per ton of CO2, we get to a size of the fund of around 40 billion euros until the end of the decade. However, as I said, there is no ring-fenced element for aviation that I would know of. There is one ring-fenced element which is linked to the money that is being generated from collecting fines. So member states are obliged to collect fines for non-compliances with refuel. And the amount of money, that's obviously hard to predict how high that will be, that money is ring-fenced for projects that try to lower the price gap between SAF and conventional jet fuel. So this is the only ring-fenced element that I would know of. Maybe to conclude, I'll add a few sentences on the Swiss approach. There, as I mentioned, we will fully align in terms of the stick. So to the EU, we will fully adopt the EU refuel regulation, and we'll have an equivalent blending mandate in Switzerland, so that there will be no distortions in competition. However, with regard to the carrot part, we go a bit a different way. There we follow the paradigm of taking some money, obviously, out of aviation through the ETS, which is aligned to the EU, as well as the fines, but we want to keep that money in the aviation sector. So it is ring-fenced for aviation projects, and is topped up with some government subsidy that's generated from general taxation, leading to a fund for SAF scale-up projects until the end of the decade of around 400 million Swiss francs.
No, thank you, Marcel. So just a couple of comments. So I guess the core of it is the 20 million SAF allowances, which I think we heard yesterday, obviously depends on the allowance price, is worth somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion euros. I think the general view is they will go pretty quickly. So we're going to need a lot more than that, and I believe there is provision to double it, but we're probably going to need to triple it or quadruple it. But of course, that's a user incentive, so it helps reduce the prices for airlines. And the Innovation Fund, I don't know if this is well established, isn't it? The Innovation Horizon Funds, if you've had experience of these. One of the requirements that we've asked of the EU, if you could streamline that process, because it's quite complicated applying for these funds. In fact, I've heard it often said it's much easier to build a SAF plant than apply for a UU grant. So there you go, if you can streamline that process. So yeah, Ruben, your perspective.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the poll, which has changed quite a bit. And if we look at the effectiveness of policies, Marcel said something about the carrots which are actually in place in European context. I just want to stress that something like a mandate is an effective policy. And I think airlines, they especially Air France, KLM, we do support a mandate, because it's something, it will push all airlines to do the things which not every airline will do by itself. So it's a good thing. However, with Refuel EU, I see some colleagues working on the file. We need to get clarity, because the law is already in place. The mandate starts January 1st, 2025, and many things are unclear. how are things going to work? What's the interaction with Renewable Energy Directive? How are things going to work with EU ETS? How are we going to make sure that the level playing field is maintained? So there are a couple of issues there which we need to fix, and we need to fix them quickly. Because that's something which also will help to facilitate all kinds of carrots. If we're not sure that a carrot is supporting additional uptake beyond the mandate, we get into all kinds of state aid issues possibly. So that's something which we need to avoid. And those carrots are needed to get European production and use ongoing. Relying on imports is something which is not, I think, the best idea for airlines, because we buy sustainable aviation fuels around the world. So for us, it doesn't make sense to bring a fuel which is produced in the US or in Singapore to Amsterdam, if we can buy it over there as well. So we need to make sure that Europe gets sufficient production going, especially in view of the steep increase of volumes under the Refuel EU mandate. Production lags behind in Europe. And last but not least, it's something where I think that if we look at airlines in general, in Europe we're faced with a mandate, but we see around the world that more and more airlines are creating the willingness to pick up fuels. So we should do, and that's for an airline very important, whatever the carrot is, however the stick is going to work, we should make sure that it's not something which is driving prices unnecessarily up. Because if we're not fixing affordable and sustainable fuels, in the end, you as you sit here traveling in an aircraft will pay the bill. And that's something which we try to avoid as much as possible.
No, thank you, Ruben. So I think, yeah, and particularly that point, I think everyone's reasonably confident that we can hit the 6% level by 2030, particularly given we're going to have some pretty major plants here in Rotterdam, for example. It's the ramp up from 2030 to 2035 where you come 6% to 20%, and 20%, depending on your map, that could be up to 10 million tons of SAF. So that is a very big ramp up.
True, but at the same time, you saw the global picture on where you have mandates, and it's already a product which is being shipped from Rotterdam. It's not a guarantee that's being supplied in Europe.
Right.
It goes across the world to a market where it brings best value for money for those who produce the product. So,
no, very good. So I'd summarize that as Europe, yeah, it's a pretty big stick. So the mandate, the baby carrots maybe, but they're quite well hidden. So you got to go and find them. So we can think about that. So over to the US. So Ken, give us your perspective on US policy.
Right. So if you think about the incentives that the U.S. has now, most of those come out of the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed about a year and a half ago. And so there are a lot of pieces to that you have to try to understand. One, well, overall, the administration itself actually set up what's called the SAF Grand Challenge. That is a very broad effort to try to incentivize SAF, both technology development as well as deployment of facilities. And Graham will talk a little bit more about some of the grants that kind of come along with that to fund R&D and pilots and things like that. But overall, the idea is to ramp it up as quickly as possible. The challenge targets about 3 billion gallons, which is 9 million tons, I think, in 2030.
Thank you.
And by 2050, 36 billion gallons, or about 100 million tons. So, and that's the target. And I think that actually there's a 50-50 chance we might actually hit the 9 million in 2030. But when it comes to the policy pieces, there are kind of several big pieces at the federal level. One are tax credits, and there are multiple types of those. The IRA is obviously not just about renewable fuels, it's about batteries, it's about wind, solar, pretty much anything that is green. But there are a couple of specific tax credits there that are important. The U.S. is really leaning in to carbon capture and sequestration. So while we don't have an ETS system, we basically put a price on carbon if you sequester it of about $85 a ton. If you're using it for direct air capture, it's $120 a ton. So that instead of being a credit becomes a tax credit that you can actually take. And that is, carbon capture has been around quite a while in the U.S., But about, if you look maybe 6 years ago, there might have been 6 wells being producing or sequestering carbon in the U.S. In the last 3 years, 100 permits have been requested. So that just gives you a sense of the ramp up of what that tax credit has done. A lot of that is for renewable fuels, including SAF. So that's one piece. There's a clean fuel production tax credit. There's a SAF tax credit. There's a clean hydrogen tax credit that targets $3 per kilogram. So depending on the industry you're in and the technologies you're using, the idea here is that there's a tax credit that will incentivize a lot of the different value chains within the green economy, and specifically, in particular, around SAF. But in addition to the tax credits, which tend to get a lot of the headlines, also the IRA kind of supercharged an agency within the Department of Energy, which is basically a green project finance bank. This was a very small agency, about 20 years old. It initially funded the first Tesla Gigafactory in 2009. And with the idea being that you can finance projects that may not be able to get commercial finance because the technology is new, it's first of a kind, what have you, and commercial banks just won't finance it. And so then the Department of Energy can finance that, and it creates an industry or creates a move in that space that can then be deployed with multiple projects afterwards in the commercial finance space. The difference here is that the IRA provided $400 billion in lending authority to this green finance bank that's run out of the Department of Energy. And it's pretty much typical project finance. I think the realization was that tax credits alone were not going to be what would make the deployment actually happen. Project finance was a critical component to this. And as a result, now you're seeing a lot of these announced projects that Jonathan showed earlier. I would guess a lot of them are looking to get financed through the Department of Energy as a result of that project finance bank. And the benefit there is that it's pretty low cost financing. You know, we're talking 5-6% interest for these types of projects. So those are some of the big things there. The other thing about the policy is that it's technology agnostic. As long as you can demonstrate via a validated life cycle analysis type model that you are lowering GHG or global warming potential, then you can qualify for these tax credits or for this financing. So that's why we basically are taking that all of the above strategy when it comes to technology and SAF in particular, because the belief is that we need every technology, because the ocean of SAF that's needed is not going to be done by 1 or 2 or 3 technologies. It needs as many of them as possible. So that's probably the biggest, some of the biggest things there.
Thank you, Ken. And Graham.
Great. I'm going to continue on the Inflation Reduction Act side and share information about some of the buckets of carrots that we have in different programs out there.
Carrot-tastic.
And they're very much thought of as buckets because they come through in the original statute as appropriations with sort of title and basic description, but then it's up to the various agencies to do the work in terms of setting up the program structure and the eligibility requirements and the process. And even though it's 2 years old, most of the money that was appropriated in the Inflation Reduction Act is still there. And much of the money has not even been programmed yet. And there is, as you could imagine, somewhat of a rush right now to program that money and get it out as quickly as possible, given the signals that the opposition candidate would take a very different approach to some of these policies out there. So specific to SAF, the two buckets, one is for about $50 million. It's called Fast Tech, and that's across the space also on the electrification side in the aviation space. The other is about $250 million called Fast SAF for production, transportation, and infrastructure. And these are all grant-structured funds that I'm speaking to here. And then we have lots of opportunities where you might have industrial facilities that, depending on their feedstock, depending on their process, might qualify. For instance, in the methane reduction space, there's 1.5 billion in funding there. In terms of looking at sort of power to liquids and electrification, there's almost 10 billion for rural electrification and off-grid operations. Benefits to air, water, and soil. This is in the U.S. Many of these are in different agencies. The first ones were in DOE. These are now in USDA. For air, water, soil benefits, there's 8.4 billion in that grant area. For advanced industrial facilities, which could mean all manner of things, almost 6 billion there. Half a billion for hydrogen production. And specific to electrolytic hydrogen, another 1 billion in funding there. Long duration storage, energy duration storage, about $500 million between those two. Kind of zeroing in on one example, because this is really a grab bag. EPA has a climate pollution reduction grant program that was originally $5 billion. Those are block grants that go to the states, and then the states have the authority. In the case of California, its primary goal is to get substantial funding up to $500 million for woody biomass to liquid fuels, potentially to SAF projects, to deal with the oversupply of biomass that we have, all the wildfire risk reduction we need to do in the forests out there. So very large pot of dollars, and then over $1 billion for brownfield projects. Switching gears, we really have two other primary policies that are really a blend of carrot and sticks, and I'll do them very quickly here. The first is the renewable fuel standard that folks have probably heard about. It's been around since 2007 was the authorizing legislation. It basically has buckets of RINs and different RIN categories according to carbon intensity reduction as determined by EPA. For sustainable aviation fuel, you're going to be in the D4 RIN category, where you have to hit a 50% greenhouse gas reduction in order to qualify. You're also in that same category with biodiesel and renewable diesel. And in that situation, the petroleum refiners and importers are obligated parties. They have to have sufficient number of RINs in all the required categories at the end of the year. So that's where you're sort of carbon, it's not really, it's sort of a hybrid program. I wouldn't really call it a carbon-based program. It's got a carbon component to it. But what we've seen, so those obligated parties have compliance costs, obviously, either doing sufficient blending of the fuels, so they've got that motivation to blend, or buying credits out in the marketplace to make up for any deficit obligation that they have. Those D4 RINs had a very robust price. But we have been somewhat victims of our own success from a market supply standpoint. We've seen tremendous growth in renewable diesel. There's a good Argus article last week. Falling D4 RIN values alter RD strategy out there. We had a jump in 1 year, 36% jump up to 3.4 billion gallons a year of capacity in the US, so about 11 million metric tons of renewable diesel, and expected to see almost a 30% jump again this year. That's caused a 75% value drop in the D4 market. And so we're seeing some of the plants that have optionality. We've seen both two plants in California switch over from fossil diesel into renewable diesel, and now there's some talk of switching back if those RIN values are too low. So it's a really dynamic situation. Really shortly on the low carbon fuel standard programs, we have them now up and running in California, Oregon, and Washington. Like the I don't think I mentioned this, but in the RFS, aviation fuel is not obligated. So those gallons are not obligated. It's the on-road transportation. Same thing in the low carbon fuel standard. It's an opt-in basis where SAF can participate and generate credits, but the airlines do not generate deficits. Though California has proposed an LCFS, intrastate LCFS, that would create an obligation for conventional jet uplifted for intrastate, so point-to-point California flights, and that's a to-be-continued situation. That oversupply in the California market. We're at about 65% market penetration of renewable diesel and biodiesel. So 2/3 is not petroleum diesel in California on the road right now. That has oversupplied the California LCFS market to where we're down now to about $40 a ton. So that was a long spiel, but those are a lot of carrots to think about.
Well, that's pretty, that's a lot of buckets of carrots.
Well, and Jonathan, just one last thing I neglected to mention is that the other tax credits that we actually have as well are state-level tax credits.
Right.
Most of what we talked about today are production types incentives, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Some of the state have now actually started to implement tax credits for consumption of SAF. Illinois is one of the leaders there. $1.50 per gallon tax credit. You don't have to make it there; you just have to consume it there. So Chicago, these types of things. Washington State has followed on. Minnesota has followed on. Nebraska just followed on. So there are multiple states now following on that as well. So you end up with a little bit of incentive on the consumption side.
Yeah, no, and I think that's really important. So overall, I'd summarize that. Well, that's a big, juicy carrot. Yeah, but it is primarily focused on supply. But as you say, they're starting to introduce incentives for consumption, because that's the complaint we hear from many US carriers, is, that it's very difficult for them to build a business case. And so if you look at that scenario, very strong demand driven by mandates in Europe, very strong supply incentive to the US, you're going to have an arbitrage of SAF crossing the Atlantic until you get some of those incentives for airlines in. And in fact, I think I was at an event last year where a very senior representative of the Department for Agriculture said, yeah, one of the policies here objectives is that US farmers are going to get wealthy supplying SAF to the rest of the world, which, hey, if it works, it works. Yeah. And just from an IAG perspective, I mean, we set a target of 1 million tons of SAF by 2030. We set that in 2021 when the global supply was 100,000 tons, 10 times. So that was an interesting conversation with our board. Are you sure? We have secured 330,000 tons of that, but 90% of that is coming from the US. So I think it sort of reinforces the point that the supply incentives are working effectively in the US. I'll quickly mention the UK. I feel like we're the orphan in between the EU and the US, but stuff is happening there. We got the mandate, 2% by 2025, 10% by 2030, 22% by 20. So it's quite ambitious early on, but then it flattens off. And basically, the government has said, we'll wait and see what happens before we decide what the mandate looks like beyond that. The one unique feature of the UK policy is we've got a heifer cap. Yeah, now there's been a lot of debate and conversation around that. The reason for that is we're not going to have much of a heifer industry in the UK because we just have very limited feedstocks. So the government wants to send a signal to get investment early into 2G SAF, alcohol to jet, and gasification Fischer Tropsch. So to avoid the market being flooded with heifer, they've put a cap. Now, thankfully, I don't know if you saw the first consultation that frightened a lot of us. One of the scenarios was no heifer would be allowed to meet the UK mandate. That was very frightening. Thankfully, I think common sense has prevailed. So you can have 100% heifer for the first 2 years, and then there's a slow reduction in the amount. So 71% of the mandate in 2030 can come from heifer, and that reduces to 35% in 2040. We think that is a much more realistic reflection of the likely onlining of 2G SAF. The other element I talk about is the buyout. We should mention this yesterday. So this is, if you don't meet your obligation, you can pay a fine. This was a bit of a surprise as well. It's very high. So the buyout, and again, this is trying to set a price signal, particularly for 2G SAF. So it's about $6,500 a ton for the main buyout, slightly higher, $7,000 a ton for PTL. So that's very high. Now, one of the things we're concerned about is if the heifer market starts to price at the buyout. Now, the view is that there's enough heifer, competition in heifer supply won't do that, but the government have said we will intervene very quickly if that starts to happen in the market. So it is a big stick approach. There is a carrot, and I mentioned it yesterday, I'm going to mention it again, the revenue certainty mechanism consultation. So this is the incentive for suppliers. They're looking at a sort of contracts for difference mechanism. We encourage everybody to respond to this. Despite the election announcement that is carrying on, the deadline is June the 20th. They've outlined 4 options. There's a clear preference. So I think the answer is yes, we like the preference, but there's 2 key issues. One is the timing. So they're not due to implement it until Q4 2026. Way too late. So if everyone can say, no, can you get that in next year rather than 2026? The other one, how's it going to be funded? Now, we accept industry funding, but the obvious solution for that is got to come from Aviation UK ETS revenues. Aviation, we put about £500 million a year into the UK ETS. That's going to double once they get rid of the free allowances to £1 billion. That money should be used to support these projects. So if you can put those 2 points in your responses, that'll be great. So that's an outline of, let's talk about some of the pros and cons of the different approaches. I think as we sort of started getting into that, but if we start with the EU, so Marcel and Ruben, what gives your views on some of the pros and cons of the EU approach?
Yeah, maybe I can start briefly, but because I think in order to make that assessment, it's important to sort of understand the political realities in Europe that have led to the shape of the policy that we're discussing. And I've spent a lot of time in the Swiss Parliament, also talked a lot with colleagues in Europe. And if I talk in these discussions with politicians, I usually got one statement back when I said, why not keep the money in aviation? Why not use money that's coming from general taxation directly through grants or indirectly through tax credits? Is one sentence, which is, look, aviation has huge external costs. The passengers are not carrying the costs that they create. GHG emissions, of course, but also noise. And we want politically that the passengers pay the green transition. That's what I get back. And I don't see how we can change that paradigm in the sort of short to mid-term in Europe. What worked out in Switzerland and somewhat, I think, in Europe is to say that if we take money out of the aviation system through the ETS, for example, at least let's ring-fence it for aviation or for the green transition in general, where aviation projects can then try to make their case to get access. So I think within this space, I think this explains a lot the nature of the policy that we are discussing now. Now, in terms of advantages, disadvantages, I think, Ruben, you're probably better qualified as a representative from an airline to answer that, but maybe I'll just add one element here is that I think also my French colleague mentioned it on the first panel today, is that if we look at the goal of the refuel policy up until 2035, we really need to get our act together to raise supply also within Europe, especially focusing on second generation SAF. And with the current stick and carrots, I don't really have a clear view on how that's going to happen. So that might be a disadvantage.
Yeah, well, just to start off, pretty jealous, and we had to make sure that the colleagues from the US, that they didn't take the 45 minutes to talk about all the carrots which were there. And that's something which is, of course, completely different in Europe. So that's something which I think, listening to what they said, we're jealous to see that there is such a big amount of money available for setting up production capacity, and in addition to that, that usage is being supported in some way as well. And the EU ETS and self-allowances from the usage side, but we need to make sure that we get the production also something in place which is solid and sufficient enough to really get those things going. And the lesson which we, I believe, can learn is that the technology or feedstock agnostic way, we should put basically the objective at the center. And in Europe, we tend to basically limit ourselves in what we can do, what is allowed, what's not allowed, on how to do it. So many things which I think are missing in Europe. And on the other hand, one thing which I still believe is still a positive, and I said it before, the mandate in Europe, it triggered something. It will get something going. Now we need to make sure that we do it the right way.
Yeah, it creates, I agree. It creates a very strong demand signal. And one of the things we've talked about a lot of this event is, where are the energy companies? They are moving now. They're starting to invest in plants. But I think the mandate, that drives that faster. Yeah, which is good. I guess the question, there's good focus on HEFA and PTL sub-targets. The one bit that seems to be the gap in the whole EU framework is on 2G SAF. And we saw that in one of the charts. There just seems to be less focus and incentives for 2G SAF, which is going to be an important part of the mix.
Yeah, I think we need as much of everything. And as long as we make sure that we reach the CO2 objectives and stay within certain boundaries, which we say about sustainability, I think the whole division in this various subtypes of fuels could be a European burden.
Thank you. On the US side, are there any cons? It all sounds pros.
Well, it depends on your perspective, I suppose. The U.S.-based airlines will tell you they'd love to have a mandate because they don't want to pass on higher costs to consumers unless they can blame the federal government.
But that's not likely to happen, is it? No.
I think from a developer's perspective, the incentives are pretty strong, but it does make it very complicated because when you're looking at offtake contracts, and I was listening to some sessions yesterday, some of the financing sessions, offtake contracts, 10-year, 15-year type contracts, how do you actually structure that deal? And so when you look at these carrots, you have to stack them. And you have the fuel value, RFS, tax credits, LCFS, it gets very complicated. And some of these are more certain. Tax credits may be more certain until they expire. The LCFS and renewable fuel standard are more volatile because they're traded. So it makes the offtake contract structure very complicated, but doable, I think. And you have to be kind of creative to make it happen. But the other big thing on the pro side is that project finance piece, because if you don't deploy, and build these things, and be able to get the financing for it, you're not going to go anywhere. And the sheer volume of money and investment needed is just enormous. Because most of these SAF projects I see are 2 billion-ish, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little more. And that's when you start to say, I need 100 plants in Europe at 2 billion a pop, that's a lot of money. And so being able to, and the banks I talk to, they can finance a couple, they can't finance 40, and so, or 50 or 100. So I think that's one of the big pros that we have, is that green finance bank.
Yeah, and Ken kind of talked about the CapEx side of that, and we also have some real challenges and complexities on the OpEx side. We talked about what's happened with the LCFS markets and the RFS markets. Both those markets have the ability for the regulators to move the markets effectively and adjust, and EPA can set that D4 RIN level, but they've been doing so in a very non-aggressive manner. Much less than the producers wants to see, and clearly less than what the market can bear out there. In California, we've had a very extended rulemaking, unfortunately, for lots of reasons. We just got the word that we're not actually going to the governing board probably until November of this year, and that market has been oversupplied for a long time. So those, and I think Andy Schaefer from GEVO did a great job on earlier panel talking about the need for there to be a robust carbon value. But this is, it is asking the regulators to do new work and participate in markets in a way that they're not necessarily comfortable doing. To respond to market forces and adjust is difficult, but I think it's really necessary within the carbon markets to make that work. Then we've got the complexity around essentially how do you align if you've got a SAF producer in the U.S. That's obviously thinking about complying with LCFS, getting the best possible carbon intensity score, meeting what they need to under first 40B and then 45Z to get the SAF tax credit, but then maybe they want to supply in the European market and they want to supply into a market, so they want to be CORSIA compliant. And we've got, frankly, sort of all of these conflicting life cycle analysis approaches that are happening out there that are still under development. We have a lot more, I would say, confidence in the ability of the U.S. agricultural system to deliver a lot of biomass. We've got the USDA that does a 1 billion ton report. We've got massive amounts of underutilized biomass here, so that's one of the factors here in the U.S. and also in Brazil that we're seeing is these countries that have massive feedstock supplies, and as long as we're in the biogenic zone, whether you're talking about finished fuels or feedstocks, those are going to be big sources for Europe for a long time here.
No, very good, very good. So sort of summary, I guess, is massive supplier incentives, and I know there's stuff coming on the user consumption, and also some of I think the IRA ending in 2027, some of the tax credits so you need longevity of supply. So while you've got lots of incentives, there's some bits that need to be worked on. We're nearly running out of time. There's a couple of questions. Maybe I'll come to you, Ken, or Graham, on the US. But the one question, I think, the burning question is the elections coming up. How much risk is there in this policy? And we get that all the time from, and of course, very relevant in the UK because they announced election July the 4th. So our general view, if I just give 30 seconds on it, is that we spend a lot of time talking to the let's say it here, we're going to get a change of government. Yeah, anybody who thinks we're not, come and talk to us later. But we're going to get a change of government. We spend a lot of time as an industry talking to the Labour Party. They are very supportive of SAF policy, not least because it decarbonises aviation, but the jobs potential, it's in the areas that are strongholds for the Labour Party, but also for fuel security. So we think there's a good chance. The big risk for us is, will it cause delay? And of course, we've got a number of projects being developed in the UK, and that's dangerous if you get delay in policy. So one of the things we'll be working very hard is and maybe we can turn it on its head. This could be a quick win for the Labour Party, come in and say, look, to prove you're more effective than get this revenue certainty mechanism in next year rather than 2026 to prove that you made the right decision voting for us. But obviously in the US, you're in the same position with an election.
Yeah, and it's, the general answer is it's hard to know, but I think that generally what I hear right now is that there are likely to be some changes on the margins. I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric around maybe repealing the IRA and doing all these sorts of things, but when it gets down to the actual implementation and deployment, I struggle to see that they're going to really reverse course because a lot of these projects are being built, but maybe 65% of the IRA money is going into districts that the other party might win, win. And so I struggle to see any congressman or senator saying, I want to kill my $2 billion SAF project in my district, right? And so at the end of the day, I think that there may be some tinkering on the edges, but that it'll likely pretty much stay as it is. And that side really loves tax credits. So I think there's already a move afoot. I saw one of the questions earlier around some of these tax credits that look to expire. There's already a bipartisan effort to actually extend some of those tax credits for another 10 years. So I think that kind of shows the agriculture industry is pretty notorious for this. It doesn't matter which side you're on, they're on side for the agricultural industry.
Cross-party support,
and we're seeing some similar things.
Yeah, I'd give a little bit of a counterpoint there. My concern is, and my friend Aaron Robinson talked about relocating over here to Europe, where there's a much more mature climate policy than we have in the U.S., and that is very much the case. I don't know if we're 5 or 10 or 15 years back, but we really have our first climate policy now, and if we go to an administration that is essentially anti-climate policy, I think that's going to be a real setback. But don't disagree that many of the financial benefits will create momentum for programs to continue, but for the U.S. to get really serious about climate policy, it would be a major setback.
Right. No, thank you. We have run out of time, but can I offer that if you maybe in the break, if people want to come up to you, because there's a lot of questions on the US side, if they could come up to you, that'd be great. But just to close, and fascinating result here, that actually it switched from 64 to 36. So it feels like that's a vote for mandates, isn't it? Yeah, so thank you for that. What we're going to do, just in way of closing, if you can give us maybe 10, 15 seconds, in a year's time, what looks like success to you? So start with you, Ruben.
Well, for me, it will be a very clear and effective implementation of refuel. If we can arrange that, the other things will follow, I believe.
Marcel?
And if most fuel will be produced in the US and the Europeans are going to buy it, I guess we need some progress on a book and claim system that works. So I have some hopes in that.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, and I'd say if we get enough policy alignment that we can kind of de-risk some of the factors that go into financing the plants out there, that would be a real success.
And I think that, again, I think the booking claim is an important one because you will have that arbitrage, I believe, in some ways. And the longevity of the policies, both on either side of the Atlantic, is really the most important.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panel. Thank you.
On the panel, we had the Godfather, and then we had the Godfather of SAF, which leads me to Godfather Part 3. Where's Patrick? Right there, Godfather Part 3. Well, we just had a fantastic discussion on policy. We discussed about buckets of carrots. I'm sure there'll be some salad available outside, lots of carrot salad, and the gents from the US will be there. But I think it is important to have the airline perspective, because the airlines are ultimately the users of this fuel and the ones who are building this into policy and bringing this, making this a reality. So that will be led by Patrick Edmond, like I said, Godfather 3, to come and lead this airline discussion. Please, Patrick.
Thanks, I think. I'm kind of expecting the Godfather theme music to start now, but I'm hoping it doesn't. Come on, let me invite my panel up and I'll introduce them as they go. We have a super panel this morning. We're talking about the airline perspective, and that also brings in the aircraft lessor perspective. Seat, ladies and gentlemen, because lessors are so important in the airline ecosystem. So briefly to introduce our panel, and we'll get into the discussion very quickly. Starting over here, I was going to say on the extreme left, but that's not really the case, is Lisanne van Wijngaarden, who's the Sustainability Manager with KLM, Erin Robinson, who's the Vice President of SAF for the US for IAG, Anne-Sophie Herlen, who's the Vice President of Sustainability for Scandinavian Airlines, and Donal Hanley, who's the Head of Government Affairs for AerCap, which is the largest aircraft lessor in the world. So our brief this morning, our title is Quickfire Perspectives on Pathways to Aviation Decarbonization. That's a bit of a mouthful, but what we want to get into is what the airline and indeed lessor perspectives are on this whole debate about SAF and decarbonization. How are airlines thinking about this? We've heard over the last day or two that the mandate within Europe doesn't fall directly on airlines, but nonetheless airlines are the end customers for this. They are the ones who have to get the customers to the passengers to pay. So, let me kick off straight away and throw this one out to the airlines. What is driving your sustainability policy? Is it something that you develop internally? Is it external customer pressure? How do you define the sustainability policy? And Lisanne, may I start with you?
Sure, yeah, I think it's a great question to start. And I think the great answer is probably a combination of the aforementioned. It's a very classic answer. But I'd like to add one extra factor, which we've really implemented at KLM, and that's that we've really made it core of our strategy. So I think a couple of years ago, you would see an airline having a strategy and then having a separate sustainability strategy. We made that switch about 3 years ago, where we really made it the core part and our mission and our purpose to work towards pioneering sustainable aviation. I think the other things you mentioned, like regulatory pressure, we had a couple of great panels on refuel already. I think they're good in pushing the market, but they're essentially giving us a floor, right? They're giving us a minimum level. And we have the ambition at least to do more. I think for consumer pressure as well, we've maybe experienced that a bit more than some of the other airlines. I think that's definitely a factor at play as well. But I think for us, what's really helped is making it a core part of our strategy.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned consumer pressure, and we're not going to talk about anything that's sub judice at the moment. But just in general terms, if there are NGOs, for example, putting pressure on or making noise about this, is that, how will I put it, is that helpful for you in terms of helping to define your strategy, or is it just, oh God, here they are again? In other words...
It's a difficult question to put straight in the first 5 minutes of the panel.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No. It's, I think it's good. I think as the sustainability team, and I think Aaron and Anne-Sophie will have this as well, we try and be that bridge towards the outside voice and really make sure that we bring that in. So I think it's good to hear that voice. I think the form in which we express that voice obviously has, you could disagree on that.
Sure.
I think court cases in particular take up a lot of time of people in the sustainability team who all join the sustainability team to push the frontier further and not actually stay within, preoccupy yourself with sticking to laws. And I don't think anyone actually who's in sustainability, that's no one's favorite part. No. But I do think it's necessary, and I think that's the only thing where we really need to make sure that we don't lose the momentum where we're looking back and that sort of thing. So it's definitely up all the way forward.
That seems very reasonable. And Sophie, if I can ask you from your point of view, I mean, Scandinavia is also known for a certain amount of consumer pressure on sustainability.
And some activists, yeah. I would say the first and foremost, the driver for buying SAF is our internal work and owner perspective. We have 2 states still owning us, and we have been a driving force for sustainable aviation for a long time. So first of all, and then we have the activists. They are not really interested in us buying SAF. They are interested in us stop flying.
Okay.
But what they give is flight shaming. So no one would ever want to talk about that they are flying domestic, for example. And for that reason, I think to offer biofuel tickets as an option to decrease their carbon footprint is a very good way and a very appreciated way. So we can see just for the last year when implementing those tickets that approximately, since we have mandates in Sweden and Norway, 50% is of our SAF purchase is from mandates and 50% is actually carbon from our customer purchasing.
Okay. Oh, excellent. And Aaron, from IAG's point of view, obviously you're covering a multitude of airlines and markets, but sustainability seems to be becoming a more central part of IAG's activity, and certainly you've been at the forefront in terms of major offtake agreements.
Yeah.
So how do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely, Patrick. I mean, I think sustainability is, well, like most things in business, there's always going to be a tension between what's important and what's urgent, right? And sustainability has always been important, but the urgency has been historically quite low.
Yeah.
With things like mandates, now that urgency level kicks up and it becomes, an imperative to take care of that problem now. I mean, I liken it in some sense to a parent-child relationship, right?
It's early for us to be getting into psychotherapy.
No. I've got something here. A child will often say, "Oh yeah, I'm going to clean my room and I'm going to do my homework," right? And it takes a while. The child doesn't get around to it. The parent goes and does a little bit of a bribe. Here's some ice cream if you do it, right? At some point, you have to offer a second scoop of ice cream, and at some point, the child still hasn't done it, so you have to take the toys away, right? And that's the solution to get things done. And aviation, we've had a long timeline, right? We've been going through it. We've been saying, I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to take care of the problem. Just trust me. Well, we still haven't gotten to it, and so now we're at that point. In the US, side note to fall into the last panel, they're still on, I think, the first ice cream scoop, right? So we'll see how that plays out. But it's something that we have to advance, and now we actually have that financial imperative that drives the decision makers, drives the governance, in fact, to go and act.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think Jamie and the organizers are frantically rushing out to get ice cream for lunch now. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the title is about airlines, but we're thinking about the broader airline ecosystem, and a key part of this is aircraft lessors, who own a very large proportion of all of the commercial aircraft in the world. So I'm delighted that Donal from AerCap, the largest of the lessors, can join us today. So, Donal, if I can put you on the spot, how do you, as a big lessor, how do you look at this sustainability picture? You see the airlines in the spotlight, but obviously you're in this ecosystem too.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's we're looking at this purely from a so 99% of our emissions are scope 3, okay, and in our case last year, for our reported emissions, that was 44.4 million tons of CO2. So, and that's going to grow for us.
And that's a lot.
Yeah, it is, and it's probably the combination of the airlines together here on stage. And that's going to increase because we'll be reporting our engine emissions and our helicopter fleet emissions in the years ahead under CSRD. We look at this in terms of, what's directly within our control and where can we influence. And we have to balance two things against that, and that's, obviously it's meeting our customer expectations for access to lift for fleet, but at the same time meeting our investor expectations. And those two things are not necessarily aligned, completely when it comes to decarbonization. So that's a challenge. I mean, clearly we take account of all of the different decarbonization opportunities that lessors can play in, be it in SAF, be it in sustainable finance, be it in, and these are things that we've been pretty active in over the last couple of years, but it won't be a surprise to anybody that the tool that's within our direct arsenal is on the fleet renewal side. Now, people will say, oh, fleet renewal, it's business as usual, but like there are a couple of home truths that we need to remind ourselves about. We know that the fleet is going to double, so that's a challenge. But in terms of where we are at today, for the best-in-class technology, only a quarter of the world's fleet today is best-in-class technology, which means there's 3/4 of the world's fleet which will be renewed and replaced, which will have a 20% efficiency gain. So I accept and we recognize that that doesn't deal with the doubling of the fleet that Brian referred to yesterday, but it does have a very significant contribution. I think the other side of this is, we do see, and it's been said so many times, and it's important and it's a bit cliche, but the collaboration area is the other piece. So I talked about what's direct, but in terms of the influence, we try to be, and I think most people who are aware of AirCap and what we've been trying to do for the last couple of years, and lessors are very new to this space, we're newer than others, we've tried to be very proactive in our engagement and our participation in different parts of the aviation ecosystem. And I don't know if Haldane is still here, but we're very pleased that we've just joined as a strategic partner, the Air Transport Action Group. We've been working on the metric side. These are things that we can play a significant, and do intend to play a significant role in.
Okay, no, that I think is a good summary, I guess, of where the lessors are coming to, and the focus very much on refleeting, and we'll come back to maybe SAF in a few minutes. But just staying with SAF for a moment now, Aaron, IAG has been notable for a recent very big offtake agreement, which is justifiably being praised for its long-term nature. But one of the things we're seeing in general, and it's been raised on multiple panels, is a kind of a disconnect between what airlines expect in terms of the duration of their fuel purchasing and what SAF project developers are looking for. So how have you found that within IAG, making the case for such a big, such a long-term agreement?
Yeah, well, certainly regulatory policy helps. And for those unaware, Patrick's referring to our recent, this was in February, announcement of a 14-year deal with 12 for power-to-liquid SAF. And it was in annual terms, it was the largest PTL agreement to date. So the policy absolutely helps. In terms of looking at decarbonization, I mean, ultimately, we need to go look and balance the capital allocation in the long term. If we look at the four of us here, we have between us on the order of about $40 or $50 billion worth of aircraft on order. If we look at how much SAF was used last year, IATA's estimate is that was about $600 million. So we're looking at industry spent, on 1/100th of what we have committed ultimately for aircraft. So there's a huge disconnect there, and that has to ultimately get into a deeper set of balance between them. Things like the high buyout price certainly go out and do that. In some sense, it also creates maybe an over-incentive. I mean, if you look at the buyout prices in the UK, for instance, it's about, on a carbon basis, over 2,000 euros per ton of CO2. When you compare that to things like ETS, which is around 80, when you compare that to things like buying a new aircraft, which is 400 across the lifetime of the aircraft, or when you compare it to things like what academics and researchers say the entire economy needs as a carbon price, 200 to 300, you also have to say, should aviation be spending $2,000 a ton to abate its carbon, right? We've got other effective methods like buying a new aircraft to do it. So yes, we should be focusing and building that market out, but also we have to do so probably within the right financial limits and reasons, and looking at all the levers, not just within aviation, but really across the economy as a whole.
Yeah. So do you see it as a short-term distortion then?
Yeah, I mean, I would think so. I mean, in particular, the UK government has said, look, if airlines actually have to go out and pay 2,000 or 2,000 pounds in this case for the UK mandate, or they've said we're going to step in and intervene and figure out how to correct the situation. But I mean, ultimately, in the long run, it's supply, right? Things are going to be supply-driven, efficiency-driven, that create that and enable that to happen.
Anne-Sophie, from your point of view, from Scandinavian Airlines' point of view, how are you looking at SAF procurement? Are you still thinking of it in a short term, or are you working on longer term projects?
Procurement at the moment is short term, but we do collaborate with a couple of interesting projects in Scandinavia, with a focus in Scandinavia, and especially for e-fuel, since I would say the production of e-fuel will happen up in the north or in where the sun is shining all year. So either one. We do have cheap and green energy, renewable energy. So therefore, it's very interesting. So we do have discussions. We have partnered up with 2 projects, and going forward. So I'll be back about that.
But for the green energy, you're relying on where the water is falling or where the wind is blowing, not where the sun is shining.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, that seems like a good decision. Lisanne, if I can ask you for KLM, I know that KLM has also been involved in a number of partnerships in terms of developing SAF. And are partnerships your focus rather than necessarily just offtake agreements, or are offtake agreements part of that?
I think they're a part of it. So we have 3 announced offtake deals, and I think those have all been, I think, fairly long term, so 7 to 10 to 15 years as well. But I think at the core of the issue is the issue around sharing risk. Right? And I think that's the key part of the negotiations or the conversations with the fuel supplier. What share of what risk, be it price risk, be it sustainability certification risk, be it the valley of death, of what are the chances of that project even maturing. Those are risks that need to be shared fairly between the parties, and it would be unfair to put that all on the airline. So I understand why you're pitting it against each other. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And especially for airlines that self-supply, like KLM at Amsterdam, we also have more experience with fossil procurement for longer periods of time. So that really short period is not super relevant always.
No, that makes sense. We have, as I mentioned, we have a super panel here, and I'm not going to monopolize them completely, so we're very open to audience questions, and I won't just leave that to the last 2 minutes. So if anybody has any questions, there is the obviously high-tech way of doing it via the app, and they'll all appear magically in front of us. If you wave enough, if you want to be low-tech about it, we can get a microphone to you, but please feel free to fire some questions at us. And in fact, one of the questions, which is what I was going to ask next, so it's almost as though I asked that question, is about offsets. The question here, as you see, is what thoughts about voluntary nature-based offsets. But if we had been talking about this a couple of years ago, offsets were perhaps a bigger part of the arsenal than they are today. But I'm interested to get a sense of how they fit in. Anne-Sophie?
Yeah, so just looking into today's debate and or discussion of take agreements, we decided to take it away. We had carbon offsets for all our Eurobonus customers for a couple of years, but yes, the only thing they did is that our customers choose not to buy SAF, so that was counterproductive, but also that every year we had to answer the question from media, how can you use that? What project are you in? So it's a bit of that challenge did run up to the decision to take it away and instead change to a program for our customers to learn more about SAF and purchase SAF.
So SAF is really the focus? Yes,
it's definitely the focus. Then maybe in the future, or CORSIA going forward, it will be interesting, but at the moment, it's very complicated to explain, and it's debatable in the media especially.
Okay, that makes sense. And Lisanne, from KLM's point of view?
So I think, first of all, the offsets won't make flights any greener, and that's where I think the aviation industry, us specifically, have also gone wrong in the past, and that's why we've had the court case about that. We also know that offsets don't count towards the SBTI targets that many airlines, including KLM, have.
Although there is some
wiggle room, maybe, but at least for the 2030 targets for the short term, which is what I think most of the airlines are focused on at the moment, it's not an option. I think if you take a step back and you look at sort of climate from a global perspective, we know, and the IPCC acknowledges, that we need huge financial flows to the global south and to such type of projects. So I do think it's essentially a sort of bare minimum thing that you could argue society as a whole needs to do. I do wonder if you need to make that link to aviation specifically and on that flight, and I think that's where we have learned our lesson, so to say.
Yeah. Donal, if I can ask you, I'm not sure that AerCap is necessarily playing in the offset space, but just maybe from the leasing community more generally, we've seen some lessors getting involved with carbon credits or kind of exploring that.
Yeah, I mean, well, we are ourselves, because we have direct emissions that we have to deal with, and they're relatively very small in scale, but we took a decision this year just because of all the enormous amount of controversy. That word doesn't exist on our website and our ESG report. We just scrubbed it, and we have
your core prediction goes straight from N to P.
It's become a very long sentence, which is basically we're doing everything we can. We're looking at projects to reduce global greenhouse emissions as our effort to help mitigate our own direct emissions, which is offset. And it's like But this is the type of concern that our board will have around this, and the paranoia, and you have to deal with it from that perspective. In terms of where lessors could go, some have done some work in this space so far, and been able to kind of bake that into conversations with lessees for operating leases and see if there's something that they can sell on there. But it is still quite early days. I think Corsia will play a role, but it's definitely quite early for lessors. There needs to be a lot more maturity in this space before you can see us diving in deeply. The piece I'd probably, and I'd say this publicly often, is that if we have an opportunity to put very significant amount of capital into something, and this isn't just for an offset opportunity or for a SAF opportunity into an innovation fund. The challenge for lessors is there's a very good, strong understanding about if we were to put in $25 or $50 million capital into something, we know what that will do for us in terms of, we know what the returns will be for a very long period of time. We know what the liquidity of that asset will be in midlife, and we understand the dynamics around that. It's when it comes to something like this, that lack of certainty is vast, and that uncertainty is not an attractive proposition, I think, in many parts of our sector.
So from an investment point of view, if you invest, I don't know, 50 million or 100 million in an aircraft, you have a fairly good sense of what the cash flow will be, whereas if you invested in SAF, you're not quite sure what will happen. Yeah, and I don't think that should come as a surprise. I mean, the expectations are out there that lessors they've loads of money and they come in and they can jump into this. We borrow, right? And our lenders and our investors have expectations about how we deploy that capital. We've 50 billion in bank borrowings, we've 10 billion in issue bonds, and and we're spread across, in our case, we've a quarter of our business is in Europe, but a third is in Asia Pacific and a third is in the Americas, and about 10-12% is in EMEA, in Middle East and Africa. And our investors have different expectations with respect to those markets. Picking up that point, obviously, there's what the risk profile is if you're buying aircraft assets, or you have a good sense of the risk profile. Willie Walsh, for example, and others have spoken about how decarbonisation is part of aviation's social license to keep growing. And we're perhaps a little bit behind the curve on decarbonisation. Is there a risk, for example, for lessors, that if that social license goes away a little bit, that your assets in a few years' time will not be worth as much as you thought? Yeah, well, there's two. Well, firstly, on something that Willie said, he at a conference in Dublin, 500 lessors in the room, and when it came to SAF, he was very clear. He says, "I don't want you guys getting in this space directly." He told the audience that, and I just think he was talking about offtakes. I'm sure he'd have a different perspective if it was in terms of investing into funds to support. But he says, "I don't want you guys generating a margin on this because you'll screw the airlines again." Now, that's it's a good Irish kind of
perspective on things. I'm not going to say I agree or disagree, but
you know, are you suggesting that lessors would ever screw airlines?
Not at all. But
okay.
You know, like there is, you know, that's one perspective. I don't see this so much as the social license as you described, which people jump to, but it's the financial funding license. Okay, so in the next decade, depending on how things evolve, we will start to see, and you know, it's happening sooner in Europe from a lending and investment perspective, a tilt in where allocation, funds are being allocated. And if you're not seen to be, you know, going in the right direction, and if you're closer to brown than green, and staying there or getting browner, then you're in trouble. So, but to the point I made about the global dimension here, that perspective at the moment is a very strong European lending perspective. If I talk to my treasury colleagues, my investor relation colleagues, when we have these conversations with analysts, if they're European, the question around, and I'm just talking the broad ESG space, is high. If they're American, it's non-existent. Now, it was actually, there was more conversation around this space a couple of years ago, but it's pretty much gone away now. I think that's quite an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, it is. But equally for the lessors, you see a couple of Japanese-funded lessors that are getting a bit more into the green space as well.
Yeah, sure. So let's see.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to come to one of the other questions here about technologies and pathways and whether there's any preference. And obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but I would assume to some extent, from an airline's point of view, you want whatever SAF you can get. But Aaron, if I can ask you, because the IAG offtake agreement was specifically power to liquid with 12, so there was a kind of a implicit technology decision there as well.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I mean, it's looking at what we're going to need in the long term as well. So there was certainly financial considerations in that in terms of meeting PTL mandates, both and potential both in the UK and the EU. But as well, it was looking at how do we ensure that we have a long-term runway and not just one that gets cut short when HEFA maxes out, when alcohol-to-jet and Fischer-Tropsch kind of hit their own kind of feedstock or land or whatever it might be limitations. So, I mean, we know we've got a power-to-liquid need in the long term. We know it makes sense to go and advance those, right? I mean, you look at what is happening on the OEM side as well, right? They're working to remove the blend limits. The blend limits, we're not close to hitting any concerns on those, right? But there's going to be a day when we need to break that wall. And there's going to need to be a day when ultimately we need to go and break the wall and we say we're going to need some power to liquid to get us going the rest of the way. The other benefit, I would say, is there's value in advancing things early and learning things early and getting involved. It adds credibility when you bring ideas to policy discussions. It adds information and awareness and better decision-making for future opportunities. I mean, doing is always the best teacher of all. For me, one of the things I also have is I'm a licensed pilot. When I got my license in university, I had to do a lot of studying and reading and you know, understand meteorology, the aircraft systems, navigation, all sorts of great things, right? But the biggest teacher of all was getting in the cockpit and going up in the air for an hour, right? So learning by doing is always the best way, and being able to advance that is, you know, the biggest encouragement I would provide, in fact, to anyone.
Sure. I'll keep you on the spot for a second. I noticed one of the other questions is about airlines paying a price premium for power to liquid. Now, I absolutely don't mean to put you on the spot, but I would speculate that if an airline is doing a deal for a less mature technology, there might be a more interesting pricing negotiation to have.
Yeah, I mean, you can argue it both ways, right? One is, hey, it's expensive early on, and so you have to pay a big premium today. The other is, well, if you're a launch customer, right, then you know that's something that's a bit of an investment for the producer, whoever it might be. So you could argue it both ways. There's lots of ways to look at it. The other kind of piece, I guess I'd say on premiums is, as an airline, you always want to go in with a strong negotiating position, right? The easiest negotiating position is you say, I'm not willing to pay any premium whatsoever, right? The reality is it's necessary because that's what the costs ultimately entail. But You know, at the end, I mean, you noted it, Lisan, right? It's a negotiation. It's sharing the risk appropriately, and being able to figure out a mutually collective, beneficial outcome. That's the other piece. Is one of the big things we look for in producers is who is not just selling to us, but who is partnering with us.
Yes.
And is going to stand with us through thick and thin, because we're always going to have challenges. There's no SAF producer that's gotten it right from day one and figured things out immediately. Everyone has to lean on each other, in fact, to get it done.
Yeah. One of the other points, I guess, you're talking about negotiation, and as somebody has asked, a lot of airlines, IAG obviously has negotiated for its airlines in this case. A lot of airlines are doing their purchasing and so on individually. Is there an opportunity at alliance level to put this together? I was about to say, let's talk about SkyTeam and about Star, but I realize now I should be saying, let's talk about SkyTeam. So, Lisanne or Anne-Sophie, do you think about, for example, SAF purchasing principally at airline level, or is there also an alliance element to this?
Interesting question. Can we get back on that in September?
Yes, okay, that's fine.
But I think it would be a great opportunity.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right.
Especially for different technology.
Sure. Well, I mean,
going forward, because a different region has a different.
Sure. Feel free to have a live negotiation about this now, if you.
So I should specify for those that don't know. So I'm sitting here on behalf of KLM, but a lot of the fuel procurement and the SAF procurement happens jointly with Air France. So for us, we're already doing that, at least with Air France KLM. I think we've also had some sort of initial discussions within SkyTeam about would there be a possibility to, use the volume of such an alliance to also, get exactly, I think, that size and that market size that they're after. I think it's quite difficult, and we touched on it in a couple of earlier panels when it comes to the sustainability criteria and the differences in different parts of the world. I think from KLM, our sustainability criteria, back in 2012, we formed them when we did our, and they've been very consistent so far. And I think now you see the regulation differences around the world, and there's definitely, we want to source locally wherever possible. So we also want to make it a very efficient sourcing portfolio. But what makes it, I think, difficult is that SAF currently is going to do so much in our decarbonization pathway.
Yes.
And I really see risk in squandering its reputation if, the parallel has been drawn earlier to the carbon market. So we also need to be very careful on that thing. So I support it in principle. We've explored it a little bit within SkyTeam, at least. We haven't solved it. So if anyone has any great ideas, please come and let me know.
Yeah, no, and I think that makes sense, because as we've heard earlier as well, even if there is different global standards for sustainability, I can see how that would cause.
If I can add, I mean, in one world, we've done actually 2 joint deals, essentially. But it was actually even something that I had been working on prior to joining IAG. I mean, I had proposed similar kind of ideas within Star Alliance when I was at United. And we had a structure in place, in fact, with one producer in concept. The challenge was, to your point, right? Everyone's going to have different preferences around what sustainability criteria, what feedstock, what location, all of these pieces. Getting everyone aligned on willingness to pay can be quite challenging. And in fact, the other kind of big problem is, even if you get to that alignment, the benefit to the producer of doing it as a collective is, hey, it's easier on them, and so presumably you get some kind of pricing improvements with that higher volume, right? The challenge then becomes, well, if you have one airline that drops out because they can't get an approval, or there's one thing that they don't quite like and they're not willing to change it, they exit, all of a sudden you have to back up, the price starts to go up, someone else says, well, that's a problem, and the whole house of cards suddenly falls apart, right? So it's very tricky to get it done. The other kind of dynamic problem you can get in that is a bit of free riding that can go on, right? You're going to have some airlines, I think we've got 3 very good ones on here, who are well advanced, have been doing quite a lot of activity, and have had leadership positions for quite some time. But if you have others that are along for the ride and get to kind of go off of that work, well, all of a sudden that scarce asset that maybe all 3 of us are interested in, we're sharing it. we're sharing the rewards, but we're not necessarily sharing the work to get it done in a fair manner.
I can't persuade you to name any names, I'm sure, but I mean, we're talking a lot about SAF, and SAF is really the main, I'll call it, weapon in the airline's sustainability toolkit, I guess, at the moment. But later on in one of the other sessions, we're going to be talking a little bit more about greenwashing, but I want to touch on it a little bit now, and there's also one of the questions about that. To what extent does the raised profile of airlines in terms of greenwashing, to what extent does it make you hold back, or does it make you nervous about telling the story about SAF, or about focusing on this kind of sustainability issue?
I think we are very concerned, especially going, I mean, if we are going to go into greenwashing, and especially when we talk about SAF and our customers' interest of buying SAF. If we even can't say sustainability in sustainability aviation fuel, we have a challenge here. Definitely, we are definitely not saying green anywhere. And try to explain weighing every word when we are communicating around sustainability. But yes, I fear, as you also said, that we might end up in court for anything we do, any activity we do, and that's where we find the activists in the future, in the courtroom. And I really, really hope that we will have a green claims directed that are more, balanced.
Yeah, because, you know, Donal mentioned a minute ago that the word offset has come out of the dictionary. Green has come out of the dictionary. If sustainable now comes out of the dictionary, the dictionary is getting quite small.
It's kind of hard. And I also think that, I mean, we're even afraid of saying that our purpose is to fly people. I mean, no, we're doing this and that, and buy SAF and everything is fine, but that's our purpose. And we need to be better to explain why that's really important.
Maybe just to change tack a little bit in terms of, I mean, I'm echoing this and I kind of raised it earlier, but, you know, building on the previous panel about EU policy and US policy and so on, like there are other tools out there that haven't really been addressed over the last couple of days, and it's actually from our perspective, a lessor perspective, it's around compliance and disclosures and reporting, and the EU has done quite well here. In some respects, you could argue that the Climate Sustainability Reporting Directive is a pretty powerful tool in itself, and it affects all corporates depending on your size. And you know, in our case, we're going to have to disclose information in a pretty robust way, which needs to be verifiable, and it'll allow investors and banks, and well, maybe not at the public level, but to look at peers against each other, and that has a material impact on corporate behaviour. There's a requirement for you to publish your transition plan, or if you don't have a transition plan, to explain why you don't have a transition plan, which could get awkward. There are other offshoots around this as part of European policies, so taxonomy delegated act. It's a very complex piece of legislation, but it's where the OEMs, the airlines, the lessors are all brought together in terms of having to demonstrate how your assets are meeting certain criteria, certain transitional criteria in the case of aviation. So that's a good thing, because there's an opportunity there for us to there's an opportunity for us to decide to take, because it's voluntary at present if you want to try and take advantage of it, although you will have to report it into CSRD. So there are other things happening, and I think when it comes to the greenwashing aspect, that will help clean some of that out, as well as the new regulation as well.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And for those of you who are interested in that, we'll have a session later on talking not only about greenwashing, but also about some of this reporting and CSRD and so on. And Lisanne, if I can just come back to you about the question about kind of greenwashing and whether it influences the story you tell or the way you present your activities.
Yeah, I think essentially it's an educating the customer problem, maybe more than anything else. And I think the intent behind it was never malicious. But I really think it's such a complicated topic to explain SAF or alternative aviation fuel to our customer and how they want to use it, because we are asking something of them, and then you want to be able to specify, okay, it might not be on your plane, and you're not buying it for the full plane, you're only buying it for your share of it. And I don't think we've had the right tone there. So at least at KLM, we're doing a big sort of comb through all our communication and really looking at what are the right ways in communicating. Completely hear what Anne-Sophie said about words and greens and sustainables and leaves and all kinds of visual aids that we know from customer research actually work really well to help persuade someone or make someone understand what the issue is at hand. So it really is a bit of a step back and seeing what the right dictionary is to use on terms now, because we do want to be to keep communicating about our sustainability efforts, specifically I think for the airlines that are doing more than the bare minimum required by law. It is a factor that sets you apart, and we definitely want to be visible on that going forward.
No, I know one large OEM, for example, that has said literally you are not allowed to use the color green in your presentations. So, we're taking words out of the dictionary and colors out of the rainbow. So one of the questions actually Jonathan was asking, do airlines, or is there a possibility that airlines will actually get into the SAF production business? So Delta famously once bought a refinery. In fact, I think they still have it. I don't know whether IAG's or KLM's or SAS's point of view, you would actually think about investing in a refinery, or I think KLM already has some involvement or some share in a refinery. Is that right?
So we do invest. We have an investment fund available. I think there's about almost 30 million euros in there. So we do have, we really want to step into that field as well, and not just be there for the offtake agreements, and really push sort of the frontier on that for any kind of relevant technologies in the SAF sphere specifically. But I think it's different being a full SAF producer. So I think there's definitely expertise that we as an airline don't have. So that's probably a step too far, at least for now. But definitely wanting to be involved in those discussions at different levels as well.
As someone who was part of the team when Delta bought the refinery, you can talk to me privately later about that. But at IAG, I mean, we're actually involved in not just equity investments, but also part ownership, and Project Spirit in the UK in partnership with LanzaJet is one example of that, where we're quite closely involved. Now, it's not something we want to, it's out of our core, it's out of our expertise, right? We're gonna need a lot of outside resources and experience ultimately to get it done. So vertical integration is always a risk, it's always a challenge, but it's also something that we've seen ultimately as a gap. Right? And if we didn't step in, it wasn't going to happen, right? Is that where we want to be long term? No, not really, right? But is that where we need to be doing to get to success long term? It is. So it's just whatever's the right opportunity ultimately. And I think all of these for everyone, it's going to be only when it's the right opportunity and some very clear, again, partnership and the right other companies involved.
Sure.
We are definitely approached by a couple of projects that wants our involvement, but so far we have said that offtake agreements is the first step. But yes, for sure, and especially in our area, that it could be very interesting to go forward. But as of yet, we haven't.
Okay. We're coming a little bit towards the end of the session, but we have time for another couple of questions. And there's one here that I just can't resist, Donal. I'm really sorry, but
saw that.
Do lessors potentially get away too easily on a sustainability agenda as they're not as exposed to the public customer?
I mean, these are our customers. The airlines are our customers, and their needs is what our core business is, which is supplying access to, in our case, the latest technology aircraft. In a timely fashion, and I think it is a fair point, and I think what people have to recognise is that the leasing sector didn't exist, more or less 30 years ago. It's grown very quickly, and it grows each year. So today there's approximately half of the world's fleet are leased. The proportion of new aircraft deliveries every year is getting higher, so that proportion of total assets owned in the world is increasing. So the lessors are becoming more front and center, and that's why we try to be as active and proactive as possible. So I think over time, where you might see this, to answer to this question specifically, is if our investor base becomes very active. But as I said at the very start, we don't have that in a very strong way. So that isn't there yet, but that could change. That coupled with changes in the disclosures aspects will show individual lessors in terms of what path they're actually taking at a broad level. And if you're being seen to be a laggard, I think it could work against you. And I think that you could come under some additional pressure.
Yeah, okay. We're coming to the end of our discussion, but I'm just going to ask each of you from the airline side very, very quickly, just in 10 seconds or 20 seconds, if Santa Claus comes early and says you can have whatever you want in sustainability terms, subject to the laws of physics, of course, and what would make life easier? I'll start over with you. Well, whoever wants to start. Sorry, you weren't expecting to do your Christmas list today, so I put you on the spot.
This year's Christmas gift
Yeah.
is you don't ever have to report anything.
No,
I will do it for you.
For me, it's an effective way to tell our sustainability story and the good work we're doing to customers. I think we've always had this huge problem of sustainability, and SAF in particular, are things that are out of sight to our customers, the changes that are happening. That's the benefit of the technology. It's drop-in. The downside is it's hard to tell, right?
Yeah.
Now, new aircraft, do have kind of sleeker lines. They look a bit more attractive. That is kind of a symbol of progress. In airlines, we've never been able to really figure out that symbol of progress. That's why we've gone to things like leaves and other symbology and imagery. But we've got to find a better, clearer way to get that story across. That's for me.
That sounds good. Anything you want to add, Lisanne?
Aaron stole my answer.
Okay, good.
No, I think if anything else, if I can come up with a second thing, then I would really go for a way in which we can get that customer to change their say-do gap. So we're noticing, I think Anne-Sophie mentioned it, a really big say-do gap. Everyone says it's really important and they're not really actioning that.
Yes.
I think communication is one of those things in which we try to address that, but if we can solve that altogether, that would be my Christmas present this year.
That sounds good. And on that positive note, we will end. Please join me in thanking our panel. Thank you very much. Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you, Patrick. Really enjoyed that. Thank you. We need a symbol. We need a symbol that's not green, does not look like a leaf, and yet communicates sustainability. Now, we've all seen those white tails behind the planes coming in, right? They look beautiful, especially as kids. We would have remembered looking at those. I remember speaking with Shabnam actually a couple of months back on my podcast, and we were talking about how a couple of years ago, I think, on Google Flight Search, suddenly your CO2 footprint was halved overnight. And that's because Google removed the non-CO2 aspect from its flight search results, and I believe I hear it's coming back. But why is this so important? Why is it so important? Because it's a significant part of overall warming effect of flying. And for leading that discussion, we've got quite a stellar panel here. I would like to introduce Professor Rob Miller from the Whittle Lab at Cambridge to lead the panel with a rather distinguished celebrity list on stage. Please, Professor Rob.
Thank you very much. Hopefully we're going to have a quite lively debate today. I think the group we've got really span all the parts of the problem, so it should be fun. I'd like to start by introducing Florian Alrogan, who's the Executive Director of Aerospace Climate Sustainability at MIT, Mohammed Porkanshani, who's Director at Sheffield of the Aviation Fuels Innovation Center and the Clearing House, Sebnam Erzan, who's Head of Travel Sustainability and Transport Global Partnerships at Google, And last but not least, Haldane Dodds, who is the Executive Director of ATAG. So I'd like to start, Florian, coming to you, and I'd like you to say a little bit about what all the non-CO2 effects are and which are important, which should we care about and why?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I think that's a very important question to start off with, to make sure that everybody is up to speed with what we're actually talking about when we talk about the non-CO2 climate impacts of aviation. So let's start with where are these impacts actually coming from, right? So basically we're talking about the non-CO2 emissions of aviations and what impact they can have on the climate. And there are multiple pathways through which that can happen. Can be because aviation exhaust actually includes some greenhouse gases, or we emit something into the atmosphere that then actually leads to a change of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. So there are a number of effects that can do that. You may have heard about nitrogen oxides, NOx emissions. NOx itself is not a greenhouse gas, but as you emit it into the atmosphere, it actually leads to changes in concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, specifically methane and ozone. If you look at all these impacts, there are different timescales involved. It's a little complicated. Some studies tell you it's warming, some it's cooling. It depends a little on how you look at the problem. You have water vapor in the mix. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas. You have sulfur oxides, which are cooling, black carbon, which is warming, and then you have contrails, right? We just heard about them, the cute white line-shaped ice clouds that form behind aircraft. They form because it's cold enough up where the aircraft flies so that actually water in the exhaust plume of the aircraft actually freezes and it forms an ice cloud. It's just a normal cloud. Just like a normal cloud, it does two things. Reflects sunlight back up into space that otherwise would have hit the surface of the Earth. And if you've ever been standing in the shadow of the cloud, you know that that is cooling. But it has a second effect, because it's an additional layer around our atmosphere. It actually traps heat that is trying to escape our atmosphere. And you know that effect as well. Compare a cloudy and a clear winter morning, right? The cloudy winter morning tends to be warmer. It's because of that very same effect, because the contrail, again, it's just a cloud. Now, net, you know, every contrail has these impacts. Some contrails can be warming, some can be cooling. On net. On average, the science currently agrees that the contrail that we make are actually warming. Now, the second question you asked, Rob, is how large actually are these impacts? So I'd like to break this question into sort of like two subsections quickly. The first one is, what are the largest non-CO2 effects? And there, according to the current understanding that we actually have in the science, in all likelihood, the answer is contrails. But there's a lot of uncertainty around that, around contrails. And that's about how they form, what actually influences how long they stay in the atmosphere, the exact balance of the radiative impacts that actually happen there. And then NOx, yeah, sure, they may matter, but probably cooling, it's really more air pollution impact than a climate impact. Now, how large are these impacts relative to CO2? That's the second interesting question in that context. And you may have heard different things there. It's telling you like contrails are as large as CO2. Some are saying it's 50% of CO2. The reality is it really depends on two things. First of all, the uncertainties in the contrails that are really large. I just said that. And depending on where you are in your modeling environment, may be larger, may be smaller. And we need to acknowledge that there's just things we don't know that actually, you know, can drive this balance up or down. But that's only one dimension of this. The other dimension of this is a deeply political question. And that is how you actually value an impact which is very immediate, which is the contrail, just from a few hours, versus CO2, which once emitted stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years and has a warming effect over hundreds of years. That is not a question that fundamentally a scientist can answer. That is fundamentally a societal debate that we need to have. I'm going to leave it there, Rob.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to follow up with you from very quickly. Could you just tell us about contrail avoidance and what contrail avoidance is and how it can affect the reduction of contrails?
Yeah, no, that's very clear. I said this to you earlier. The contrail forms because water actually freezes. Well, the conditions need to be cold enough for that to happen, and it needs to be humid enough so that that water doesn't just evaporate. Well, that means that contrails don't always form. They only form in certain spots at a given time. Now, the idea of operational contrail avoidance is like, well, just don't fly through the areas where that happens. These areas tend to be horizontally very large, so flying around them is a little cumbersome, but they tend to be vertically very thin. So you can actually do a pretty simple few thousand feet flight altitude adjustment and solve the problem. Of course, that gives you additional fuel burn, but even if you take account all these uncertainties, we can be relatively certain that at a system level, that will actually get us a climate benefit at this point. But at a system level, not for every flight.
Okay, we're going to dig into that in more detail, the practicalities of some of these things and the policies as we go. But I'd like to come next to you, Mohammed. So obviously, you're very interested in all the mix of SAF fuels that are coming online, the fuels we're using at the moment. Can you say a little bit about fuels and the potential effect on contrails?
Thank you. So yes, in terms of non-CO2 emissions, of course, the source of those are the fuels chemistry. More or less, the type of fuel we use produce the particulate as well as, for example, the NO, NOx, NO2, as well as other components like SOx. So problem is the aviation fuel, even whether it's a conventional or whether we use SAF, we have to have some aromatics on it because according to the regulation in terms of getting certificate, ASTM protocol, we have to have around at least minimum of 8%, between 25% to 8% aromatics. And significant experimental data that has been done by many investigators for over 40 years, I would say, have shown that aromatics has a very big impact on the type of the particles that they produce. And more importantly, is that not all the aromatics are bad. Some of the complex aromatics, especially bi-aromatics, and otherwise naphthalene-type hydrocarbons, are cause of soot formation. Now, in principle, non-CO2 emissions from fuels doesn't really matter whether you're using SAF or whether you're using conventional fuel. Both conventional jet fuel also produces in the same way. SAF, which has some aromatics on it, will have some impact, but it still will not eliminate non-CO2. So the process, therefore, says, well, why don't we remove the aromatics from jet fuels, whether it is a SAF or whether. First of all, we have to look at why aromatics are used. First of all, it increases the molecule density, which is part of the requirement. Secondly, it has a bigger impact on the components within the fuel handling system, so as well as the engine. The swellings and all these sort of technical issues has to be dealt with. So why don't we reduce it to the minimum level? Because if you reduce the minimum level, you can do that by hydrotreatment in refineries, but then cost goes up and somebody has to pay for it. And using that with hydrotreatment, through that process, you also increase the energy consumption, increase cost, and if you don't have a carbon capture with the refinery, you also increase the CO2 produced. So there's a balance between production of low aromatic jet fuels or SAF with low aromatics, or with in terms of the impact on the non-CO2 emissions. So that's in principle the impact of the fuels.
Okay, so what you're saying is these aromatics are like cyclic molecules. They tend to form soot, and soot seed the formation. Water vapor forms around it, and they seed the contrail. So theoretically, removing those aromatics could stop or reduce, but it is a potential.
Yes. Sure.
And it would require us to scale SAFs in before we'd see the effect.
That's right. And another area that is also very important for soot formation is the hydrogen-carbon ratio of the fuel. So these are two different, but they are linked. And many industry now uses the hydrogen ratio of the fuel against hydrogen carbon ratio of the fuel against the soot tendency. It is part of the process, but not the answer to all the questions we need.
So you're saying two things, the soot formation, but also the percentage of hydrogen in water.
And we also have to keep in mind that once you increase the hydrogen content, energy density of the fuel also increases. So it will increase the, shall we say, efficiency of the fuel consumption, but produces more water. And as we know, more water also has the impact. So again, a balance in between energy density and also emissions.
Okay, very interesting. Sydenham, can I come to you next? So Google are doing a lot using satellites, using software to try and identify the Contrail formation. Can you say a little bit about the work you're doing and its potential to help us on the journey?
I'm happy to. That maybe also answers some of the questions that I have been receiving. What does Google do? Why are you in this conference? So we are working on the different aspects of this challenge, and one of them is the research piece. So we have a whole research department, and a couple of years ago they got very excited with this problem challenge about the contrails. And they said, okay, can we contribute to this, and can we decrease the uncertainty, and can we convert this to an opportunity for the industry? So we started working on a model where we are basically predicting the contrail formation. So we are giving the model tons of data, as you can imagine, the weather, etc., the humidity, and then we use machine learning and artificial intelligence to train the model. And then we make a prediction about the contrail formation. And of course, then afterwards, we are validating it with the satellite imagery. And some of the partners are testing it in the simulation process, but also I think we'll come to the live test as well. So that's how we are trying to contribute. Of course, we are collaborating on this with Rob and with MIT. We have done a great collaboration with Breakthrough. So there's an uncertainty there, and we are trying to contribute from our side too.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, Haldane, you've heard all this exciting different ways of tackling the problem. Where are we on policy? What should we be doing? We've heard a lot from the EU MRV, but tell us your thoughts. You've heard also about a lot of uncertainty in the system, both in the science, the operation, the multiple ways of doing this. Tell us what you think. Where are we on policy at the moment?
Well, before we get to that, I think it's important to look at the journey that we've come on when it comes to tackling aviation's climate change impact overall, or effects overall. And I think certainly for the last 15 years, we've been really focused on the carbon challenge in a very big way. And that was really important because if you look at the ways that we're going to decarbonize, there are some fairly big systematic approaches that we need to take. Obviously, you know, we've always improved the fuel efficiency of aircraft. That's ramping up as well. The fuel efficiency of operations, same thing. And then when it comes to fuel, putting in place a whole new fuel system and energy system for the industry is a big challenge. And so there's a lot of work that's been done already in that space, both within the technology and operations side of things, but also at a policy level as well. Really been focused on that for a long time. We're not there yet. We know that there's a lot more work still to be done. It needs to be accelerated, etc. But we've got a plan in place in a broad sense at a global level and on the policy side as well. Now, turning the attention really to the non-CO2 and particularly to contrails, as Florian said, they seem to be the biggest part of that non-CO2 challenge. And there we have a slightly different thing. Obviously, CO2 is fairly easy to understand. We know a ton of CO2 creates what impact it has on the environment, and the solutions there are relatively straightforward, if not a big challenge to put in place. On the contrail side, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of questions over exactly how to implement. We kind of know what needs to be done, but there's some big questions in the middle there as well. I think when it comes to where we need to go, and the broad sort of message that I would contribute at this stage is it's too early for policy and regulation to be put in place. We need to test and trial and investigate and research as much as possible in the space before jumping ahead to the policy side of things. Because we could have unintended consequences of putting in place policy that does not incentivize the right behavior, particularly if you're starting to do this at an individual flight level. And I think we're not quite there yet on understanding whether we should do this at a system-wide level. In other words, getting ANSPs or air traffic control providers to think about where we're flying aircraft versus trying to get individual airlines to do individual flight maneuvers, which could cause knock-on effects across the system, more congestion, potentially more contrails if we don't do it the right way. And so understanding that is really important. And we can get onto the way we go about those kind of trials and really ramping that process up in the discussion. But I think it's really important for us to get it. We're never going to get 100% right, but at least get the understanding better and the way that operational changes can impact. Unintended consequences later on could be a really important thing for us to figure out first before we go into any kind of regulation.
So I understand right what you're saying is, you've got a certain number, CO2, or quite certain, and you've got a highly uncertain number that we know is of about the same magnitude, give or take 50, depend on the metric you choose, depending how you analyze it, but we know but adding those two together or trying to make people act on those could cause sort of perverse action. And we need to understand, we need to act, but we need to act in a way that allows us to understand the problem in a better way. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not that we don't want to act on this, of course we do. And actually, one of the things that we've seen over the last few years is a real ramp up in collaboration and cooperation between industry and researchers on all these questions that we're asking. On the fuel side, on the operational avoidance side as well, we're probably going to have to tap into both, and there are solutions in both areas, but figuring out what impact those solutions have before we actually get into regulating across the entire daily operation, that's really important.
Okay, Florian, I'd like to come to you now. So we've seen, for instance, Boeing and NASA doing test flights. We know you've done test flights. We saw exciting stuff being announced by Breakthrough about maybe larger living lab type tests. What do you think about the nature of how we should act, what we should do?
Yeah, I think it's a very fine line we have to walk, right? And the very fine line is defined by the problem that at a system level, at a very high system level, we know that this is a good idea. We can be certain about that, despite all the uncertainties. Even if you go to some of the lowest impacts of Contrail that are reasonable in the current understanding, and at the highest fuel burn penalties that we actually can possibly expect from Contrail avoidance, we know there is a story there. So we clearly have to do something about it, right? So that is true on the one hand. On the other hand, Haldane has a point, right, of saying like, well, there are uncertainties. We know that if we sort of like implement this in the wrong way, we can actually end up with the wrong incentives and we might actually make the problem worse. So what does that lead to? Well, it does lead to the point of like, yeah, we need to clearly do research and development. And as you said, we've been working with Google. We are working with airlines like Delta. You guys working with American and others. It's very clear that we need to test these things. We really have to do these living labs, gain experience, what works, what doesn't work, what actually are these knock-on effects, right? We need these living labs to understand that. Right? And this is going on. Airbus is doing a lot in that context as well. Boeing is doing a lot in that as well. So all the players are there to really drive this work forward. That's great, and we need to continue this, and we're already moving at great speed, so let's keep going. Like the right questions are being asked and they're being tackled. Now comes the policy question in all of this. That's a much more thorny one in a way, because as soon as you force people to act, you have to make sure that what you get them to do actually is what you want as an outcome. And now you need to really acknowledge the uncertainties and the things that you don't know. Where are the gaps? Are they going to completely diminish the benefit pool that you know is there? So this is the trade-off that you really now have to go into. And there are very thorny questions in that. So for example, if you go to the point and say like, well, I'm going to put this, as Rob just said, into a system where I basically mix together contrails and CO2. That's a very difficult proposition because that's where the uncertainties in contrails really play. And that's where we don't have a definite answer in how we value a contrail against CO2. That is a hugely political debate that we need to have and that we actually can't leave to scientists. So let's have that debate before we actually also put these things into these systems. That's a political piece where really the policymaker has a responsibility to drive this forward. But they also have to drive this forward in a way that is consistent. There's one thing I clearly want to get across here. This is not a pick and choose. If you think the contrail impact relative to CO2 is large, then what you're implicitly saying is that the future impact of CO2 is small. You're diminishing the impact of CO2. You need to understand that there is this relationship, and I think that is the debate we need to have on top of the scientific work. And I don't think we've had that debate.
I think that debate is very important. And I think what you said before, these environments where you know there's a large effect, you don't know quite how to compare this large effect, and the uncertainties within the system are large, is a prime example of where something like a living lab is critical. Because learning by doing is so important. As soon as you start doing it, your understanding will change about the nature of how you think you should act. But you have to do that at a scale which is realistic, has real airspace congestion, and you might have to do a number of them at different places around the world. So Haldane, yeah.
No, and I fully agree with that. And I think the important thing is for us to go through that process before trying to put in place daily operation, that we're just going to put this across the entire system. Otherwise, the unintended consequences, the potential for further impacts could be really bad. And so supporting those kind of trials is really important. I would also say, and as a sort of a plea to the academic community and the research community, make sure you involve industry in that, and I know that that's certainly the case. But make sure that there's coordination between those different living labs, trials, whatever, so that we are learning from each other rather than doing things in isolation. I know that there's quite a lot of that that's already taking place, but we don't have time to lose by just duplicating work that others are doing. If we can build on each other's work, that's really important.
I think that's a really important point. Seven, you look like you want to come in here.
Yeah, I want to emphasize, I think we are discussing the different aspects of the things, right? So contrail predictions, like it has an aspect on the users. It's like what we are showing to the users, and it has an aspect on the how can we help the industry and the airlines to avoid the contrails formation. I think those are at two different stages, so to say. So I second you and Florian on when we are communicating to the users, we need to be very careful because the science is really like very uncertain, and it's very tough to convert this contrails number and adding up with this CO2 and then showing the number to the users. So that's why we don't include the contrails for the time being in the Google platform. So we are only showing the carbon emissions. But then there is the second aspect of it where we have the models and we provide the models to the airlines where they can see the likelihood of the contrails formation, and they can divert flights to other areas, and then we can check if they avoided the contrails. I think these are two different things, and we are at two different stages of like in each. And when it comes to the live trials, so maybe it's time to say that. So we have been collaborating with Breakthrough and the airlines, and we have just done a live trial test last year with American Airlines and Breakthrough. And we basically provided the contrail formation areas to American Airlines, and they diverted 70 flights, and they've seen that they avoided 54% of the contrails. And when it comes to the, of course, like fuel burn, so we checked that across the fleet, it was 0.3% increase. So because we have been also doing a lot of research on that, collaborating with the academia, but we wanted to see if this is possible. And now this year we would like to expand it to Europe, because it's two different areas, regions, and also the user experience is different when it comes to the pilots and the air traffic. So we would like to do 1 or 2 more tests with European airlines this year as well.
Could I, oh, you want to follow up, Haldane?
Sorry, I mean, that's a perfect example. You know, small scale, looking at that, we need to take it to large scale. 70 flights, we have 120,000 flights a day across the global system in congested airspace across multiple airlines. So figuring out what impact that will have later on is really important.
Well, I'd like just to follow up with both of you on that. So clearly there are a number of these sort of smaller trials happening. I completely agree, Haldane, we need to scale them up. It needs to be a coordinated way. We need to ensure the quality of these trials. Do you think we have to have some sort of NGO set up who can independently monitor this? Do you think some form of peer review? How do we make sure that these trials are happening in the right way statistically and that the evidence that's coming out is transparent? Do you want to start, Haldane, then Sevnem?
I'm not a statistician. I've never designed a trial.
But you've implemented policy at a global level, right?
Yes, but we're not talking about implementing policy now. Okay. We're talking about testing to make sure this is the right way forward. And so I guess that's a question that I go back to the academic community and say, how would, in an ideal world, how would you design that? And let's try and work on figuring out how to do that best.
Do you want to come in, Sevnem, at this point or not?
No, I would like to say, I don't know like which NGO or if an NGO is needed, but I would like to say, of course, the academia is needed to, I mean, our research team is also like the people like you, but also like we are collaborating with Breakthrough, so they're also kind of working on this for a long time. So I think it's very important to set up the trials in the right environment, because what we are, I mean, we are not trying to lie to ourselves, right? The idea is really, we would like to test if the research like really works on the...
Yeah, it would help all of us.
Exactly. So that's the most important thing. And when it comes to the scale of the flights, I think what I heard from our researchers that we need more flights in Europe than in US. So we are aiming to test with more flights in Europe, but of course, like we are a little bit far away from doing it at scale.
And I'd also just make the point, people like you, being the academic community, it's always important, I think, to remember that whatever you see on a computer model, whatever you see in your lab, when we go and do something, it happens in the real world, and we are creating a contrail or not. And so there's quite a different sort of thought process to a certain extent there, where you're actually making a real-world impact, which is why it's really important for us to test this as much as possible and to go through the challenges before we put it into daily operation.
I think the real-world sort of learning by doing is absolutely critical. Florian, you wanted to come in on this, just briefly.
Absolutely. I think this is an interesting field, right? Because the question about how do we actually ensure the quality of what we're doing is really important. It's not only important for these trials, it's also really important for policy, because that ensures that whatever we implement later actually has the impacts that we thought we had. Right. Just running it on a model that gives us some response, which may or may not be right, we don't know, that's really difficult. So one of the approaches that we've taken to this really is to say like, hey, let's make this observable, right? Let's really look at what we can measure, what's out there, what can we see, and make this basically visible to people on whether you did something or not. And there's great methods out there with which you can really sort of go and show that you made a difference in an experiment, right? The whole medical community has a great system of sort of like, you know, placebo tests, et cetera, with which you can really, without a doubt, show that something works, right? We can hold ourselves to that standard to an extent to really figure out what that is. At the same time, right, we have to be realistic for what we can actually show and what a satellite can actually help us do. But I think that's where we need to get.
So I'm going to come to you, Mohammed, but just one last thing, Florian, I think that people need to understand. So the negative plane problem, the problem, you've done all your trials, you're in operation, everybody's moving the planes, it's all working. How do you tell that plane, if it hadn't moved, would have created a contrail? there aren't those negative planes when you're in operation. And the negative plane problem is a really inherent one. Do you want to say a little bit about that problem?
That's a real issue. It's a real issue once you go to scale. However, it's actually not a problem if you don't go to scale.
No, that's exactly right.
So if for the initial trials, you can actually test whether you have models in place that can help you answer this, because you can choose the flight that you can make your test on, right? Choose it in a way that you don't have the negative plane problem. That's all I will say about that.
So in the living lab, the negative plane problem isn't there because there are some planes not making the maneuvers in the same airspace. So you can, like a medical trial, statistically look at the difference. Once you're in full operation, you're moving everyone, that problem jumps out at you. And how we deal with that, we're not clear about.
Exactly, but I mean, that's what we need some of these trials for,
That's
right?
right,
To
that's
figure out how to do that and to find a good model to answer that question.
So Mohammed, you're the only person in this group who's actually flown with zero emissions across the Atlantic while monitoring the contrails on the plane. Tell us about that.
I'm still here. and of course, within the flight, we were told by Richard Branson that he tried to cross Atlantic 3 times, twice with boat and balloon. Both of them failed. So we were waiting to see what happens, but nothing happened. And so really that flight that we were involved in terms of experimental work, it was very similar to the moonshot. It was a SAF shot to show to the government, to the policymakers, to the fuel producers that if there is enough SAF, they can do it. There is no technical issues. And the important part was on that flight was, shall we also look at it and see if we're using SAF, what happens to the emissions as a part of that process? Some really interesting findings from the work that we did. First of all, there was a definitely 40% reduction on the particulate emissions when we used HEFA at 87% and SAK at 12.7%. So there was definitely reduction in particle numbers at 40% and 56% and on particle mass. There was no changes on the NOx emissions. Of course, one area that is very interesting is that when we looked at the particle shape, they were also different. They looked very different. And that will have impact on the contrails, how the water particles can absorb to the surface of the particles. And more interestingly, does the toxicity of these particle changes, which will have an impact on local environment in the airports when the APU engines are running. So another interesting area that we also observed was that the flight from London to New York usually uses around 45 tons of fuel. There was a 0.4 tons of fuel efficiency within that flight. And that is because of not only because of the route we took, but also because of the increase in the number particle or the fuel energy density. And you may say 1 or 2% is not really a big number, but if you consider that for all the flights, therefore you will see that emission index for soot, emission index for NOx is also reduces in the same way. So the amount of CO2 and non-CO2 emissions per passengers or per flight reduces if we increase the fuel density of the fuel.
So was there a prediction done of the contrails formed on the flight, and was it measured during the flight from satellites?
No, it wasn't measured in the flight, but it was monitored in terms of available data. It was also operating at very high altitude, so it has a very different contrail impact.
Okay, I'd like to come now to public perception. I'd like to start with you, Sebnem. You know, it's clear that a year ago the public weren't even aware of this, but there's more and more journalists, more and more members of the public are becoming aware. I was presenting with Stephen and Florian to a group of students after dinner, and a young woman stood up at the end and said, "Why have you been hiding these non-CO2 effects from us?" This is a young Cambridge graduate. And I had to explain that we didn't know a few years ago that this was a problem. But this will hit us. And I know Google's very interested in the way the public perceive these problems. So do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we are a technology company, but at the same time, we are a platform with many users. So many users come to our platform to do something for different reasons daily, but one of them is their travel planning, right? So we have Google Flights, where many of the users are using it. And 2 years ago, we said, okay, we have the responsibility to inform the users more about their travel choices. And then they can decide what to do with that information. So 2 years ago, we built a model, travel impact model, that estimates the CO2 emissions, and we have launched it in Google Flights. So for the time being, when you're searching for a flight, Amsterdam to Zurich, you see the price and the date and the time of the flight, but also your CO2 emissions per flight. So we are showing per flight, per passenger. So it's basically your own CO2 emissions picking that flight. So for the time being, we are seeing very promising. I mean, 2 years ago, they don't care, but we started educating them, so to say. And also there was an accelerating effort in the industry doing more and more. And for the time being, we are seeing a lot of promising user behavior change or awareness, so to say, towards the CO2 emissions. I agree with your point, more or less. We are all aligned about the CO2 emissions and how to measure that. And we are aligned with ICAO. You know, there is the ISO standards. We are compliant. We are working with EASA. So we more or less know how to do it. And we reflect it in our model and to the users. So when it comes to the non-CO2 effects, because how we are showing it to the users is per passenger, we don't have the science yet, but we are thinking about ways how can we inform users about that there are other effects of flying than CO2 emissions, so and then it comes to the contrails. So we built an advisory committee where we have academicians like MIT, Imperial, we have EASA, FAA as the observers, and we have airlines. I agree with your point that we need to have airlines, so American, Lufthansa, EasyJet, and we have NGOs, AEF, Travelist, and RMI. So how they're working is like they're working on the other effects of that. I mean, a lot of things for the improvement of the model, and one of the pillars that they're working on is the non-CO2 effects, basically contrails. So I cannot say a lot for now, but they made a great progress. Not like we are not close to putting a number out there, but I think they're looking at ways how we can do it per route, season, it's taking into consideration the seasons and taking into consideration the time of the day. So we are trying to find a way how to inform users more about those effects. I'm sure we'll come up with something sooner than we think. Not a CO2e number, but something. Yeah, and then it's all about education. I think there are two aspects when it comes to the users. One of them is like sometimes they require information so that we show it, or sometimes we feel that we have the responsibility to educate the users. So we are doing both.
Okay, thank you.
But the point there is not to drive a difference between individual airline choices in that regard, because if you're doing it across a flight route basis, if two airlines are flying the same route, they're going to impact the same. They're going to have the same conditions, right?
No, if they're using different aircrafts, if they have different load factors, so the CO2 emissions differ between those flights too.
On the CO2 side, yeah.
Yeah.
The non-CO2 is a lot of uncertainty, exactly. As Haldane says. Haldane, there is the question here, which I'm going to ask you to answer, and it is related partly to the public as well. Why are airlines resisting monitoring their non-CO2 effects when it advances the research and helps future mitigation through contrail avoidance?
We've got a lot of airlines that are very actively taking part in these research efforts. So it's not like we're avoiding that question. I think the question probably goes to EU regulations around this. It's always called MRV. It's a bit challenging to verify this at the moment, and I think it's more just data collection in reality. But it shouldn't be regulated right now, because what's the point of regulation? It's to have an impact in the real world. What's the point of this? It's to try and reduce contrail formation or another thing, and what the EU is planning to collect, I think, at this stage is not going to help that. So what's the point of that process? If it's a research environment, that's fine. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of airlines that will hopefully volunteer to provide any data that they have to that. But to ask airlines to report things that they don't actually collect to begin with is a bit of a challenge.
Okay, so the key thing here is to differentiate between the collection for this understanding, these living labs, get move, we've got to have a real faster pace, but there is worry, because what you're saying is that some of this data will be used for other purposes.
No one's been able to explain to me, and maybe it's just because I'm too dense, but no one's been able to explain to me what the data collection exercise is going to do to actually reduce contrail formation, for example.
Okay. Thank you for that. Right, I'd like to come to each of you and a sort of crystal ball moment. When do you think we'll have a global contrail avoidance system up and running? I'm going to start with you, Florian. Come on, we need to be racy. You've got to raise ambition.
I like ambition.
You ask an MIT professor about ambition.
Well, if you would have asked me for a let me answer the question for European and the US. I think a lot sooner. I think the global one is actually tough. I would say let's go as fast as we can, but stay in that balance that I just talked about so that we don't get to perverse incentives. I cannot give you a specific date, but it's not going to be tomorrow. It's not going to be in 3 years. I don't think it's going to be in 5 years. But let's do everything we can to eventually get there. And
not 5 years, but 10 years? That's as good as I'm going to get from Florian, 10 years. and I think this statement you've just made about there are different areas of the world that are moving at different pace. So you might well get Europe and America moving faster than some other areas of the world, and they're causing, we think, more contrails than the rest of the world. So that's actually a big effect if they moved. Moving along, Mohammed.
Yes, in a very similar way. It will not happen very soon, but if we have aromatic mandate or mandate plus, that will help to reduce the non-CO2 emission.
And timescale for that, because SAF scale-up's really the 2040s. So should we be looking about removing aromatics from conventional fuel or not?
Yes, we have to, because even with the best prediction, conventional fuel will be with us beyond 2030s, 2040s, and it will use at least 70–80% blending. So we cannot simply ignore conventional jet fuels. And therefore the question is, what can we do to decarbonize or remove the non-CO2 emissions from jet fuels that will be with us, whether we like it or not?
Okay, Sebnem.
I think there's a tremendous collaboration in the industry. I mean, really, like airlines, OTAs, GDSs, academia, policymakers, technology providers, all of them. So I think it will be sooner than expected. I don't know the timeline, but what I believe there will be very important milestones in the interim period while we are reaching to that goal.
Okay.
And again, it kind of comes back to the research community to a certain extent, because putting these living labs, putting these trials in place, learning from each other, how long will that take before we actually come to an agreement over what a daily system level operational change can be? I don't know, but I don't think it's all that far away.
Oh, that's
I'm going to put a date on it.
You heard it here. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. One of the things about living labs or learning by doing is that you learn about the speed of policy implication as you do. You don't just learn about the science, and that's important. So I'd just like to finish by saying that non-CO2 effects of aviation, the Contrail effects, are one of only 2 climate impact things we can do to the climate that effectively turn back time. So if you capture carbon and you put it underground, that removes carbon from the environment and sort of turns back time. If we switched off contrails or found some global way of doing that, that will actually drop surface temperature in a similar way. It actually buys us more time to 2050. But I think, as you've heard today, there are some real challenges. There's a real urgency from the panel in setting up some form of living labs, making sure we act. But perhaps there's a bit of a consensus to hold on the policy until we learn about some of those things. But thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Well, before lunch is served, I've got a 1.5 minute summary of the entire morning, if anyone is willing to stay. So the most interesting statistic that I took away from the morning session was 33 operational SAF plants in the world today, and that needs to grow to 330 in the next 6 years. Tenfold in the next 6 years to meet all these mandates that we are hearing about. And that is not even looking at global equity. This is primarily Europe and US. What's also interesting was how a lot of the airlines talked about flying with SAF in Europe because of mandates, but buying them in the US because of production being good there, which is also quite interesting. On the policy discussion we had, which was the second panel, we had a very interesting bucket of carrots, or rather many buckets of carrots, some baby carrots, some big carrots, lots of carrots, whereas the sticks, what was interesting was how the sticks are driving adoption today of SAF as opposed to just future offtakes. And while carrots and incentives can get you lots of creative solutions towards SAF for the future, you have to drive adoption today. So a nice mix is, I think, what we should be looking at. In the airline panel, what stood out to me was not only are the airlines willing to do things and willing to try things out, I think they are very good platforms. Don't ask them to pay, but they're very good platforms. The important thing is, I think there's going to be a critical need to communicate what airlines are doing without getting a stick on their hands for greenwashing. And maybe the word greenwashing should be something else, not have the word green in it in the end. And I think that's going to be critical if airlines are to build trust with travelers again when it comes to their sustainability efforts. And finally, we just had the non-CO2 discussion. It's not just, I found it interesting whether SAF will result in contrails or no contrails. I think that's an interesting debate. I like the idea of living labs. Shabnam, you've already done some experiments in the US. There's some more coming in Europe. I think putting all those results together hopefully will give policymakers a reason to act now, because contrails are some of those few things that we can do today as an industry. We don't have to put down a $2 billion plant to wait for things to happen. So yes, there's uncertainty, but if these living labs can produce results quickly, then we can do things today. We can reduce the impact today, and like Prof. Miller said, reverse the warming effect as well. My big lesson is that as an industry, let us learn by doing. And as you step out to lunch, think about the one thing, just the one thing you will be doing from all this that we have learned this morning. And I hope you enjoyed the morning sessions, and feel free to come and say hello. Thank you very much once again.